Chapter 28 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 28. Hilary Hears the Cuckoo Sing. It was not left to Cecilia alone to remark how very white Mr. Stone looked in these days. The wild force which every year visits the world, driving with its soft violence snowy clouds and their dark shadows, breaking through all crusts and sheaths, covering the earth in a fierce embrace. The wild force which turns form to form, and with its million leapings, swift as the flight of swallows and the arrow darts of the rain, hurries everything on to sweet mingling. This great wild force of universal life, so called the spring, had come to Mr. Stone like new wine to some old bottle. And Hilary, to whom it had come too, watching him every morning setting forth with a rough towel across his arm, wondered whether the old man would not this time leave his spirit swimming in the chill waters of the Serpentine. So near that spirit seemed to breaking through its fragile shell. 4 days had gone by since the interview which he had sent away the little model, and life in his household, that quiet backwater choked with lilies, seemed to have resumed the tranquillity enjoyed before this intrusion of rude life. The paper whiteness of Mr. Stone was the only patent evidence that anything disturbing had occurred. That, and certain feelings about which the strictest silence was preserved. On the morning of the 5th day, seeing the old man stumble on the level flagstones of the garden, Hilary finished dressing hastily and followed. He overtook him, walking forward feebly beneath the candelabra of flying chestnut trees, with a hail shower striking white on his high shoulders. And placing himself alongside without greeting, for forms were all one to Mr. Stone, he said, "Surely you don't mean to bathe during a hailstorm, sir? Make an exception this once. You're not looking quite yourself." Mr. Stone shook his head. Then, evidently following out a thought which Hilary had interrupted, he remarked, "The sentiment that men call honour is of doubtful value. I have not as yet succeeded in relating it to universal brotherhood." "How is that, sir?" "In so far," said Mr. Stone, "as it consists in fidelity to principle, one might assume it worthy of conjunction. The difficulty arises when we consider the nature of the principle. There is a family of young thrushes in the garden. If one of them finds a worm, I notice that his devotion to that principle of self-preservation which prevails in all low forms of life forbids his sharing it with any of the other little thrushes." Mr. Stone had fixed his eyes on distance. "So it is, I fear, with honour," he said. "In those days men looked on women as thrushes look on worms." He paused, evidently searching for a word, and Hilary, with a faint smile, said, "And how did women look on men, sir?" Mr. Stone observed him with surprise. "I did not perceive that it was you," he said. "I have to avoid brain action before bathing." They crossed the road dividing the gardens from the park, and seeing that Mr. Stone had already seen the water where he was about to bathe, and would now see nothing else, Hilary stopped beside a little lonely birch tree. This wild, small, graceful visitor, who had long bathed in winter, was already draping her bare limbs in a scarf of green. Hilary leaned against her cool, pearly body. Below were the chilly waters, now grey, now starch blue, and the pale forms of 15 or 20 bathers. While he stood shivering in the frozen wind, the sun, bursting through the hail cloud, burned his cheeks and hands. And suddenly he heard, clear but far off, the sound which of all others stirs the heart of men. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" 4 times over came the unexpected call. Whence had that ill-advised, indelicate grey bird flown into this great haunt of men and shadows? Why had it come with its arrowy flight and mocking cry to pierce the heart and set it aching? There were trees enough outside the town, cloud-swept hollows, tangled brakes of firs just coming into bloom, where it could preside over the process of spring. What solemn freak was this which made it come and sing to one who had no longer any business with the spring? With a real spasm in his heart, Hilary turned away from that distant bird and went down to the water's edge. Mr. Stone was swimming, slower than man had ever swum before. His silver head and lean arms alone were visible, parting the water feebly. Suddenly he disappeared. He was but a dozen yards from the shore, and Hilary, alarmed at not seeing him reappear, ran in. The water was not deep. Mr. Stone, seated at the bottom, was doing all he could to rise. Hilary took him by his bathing dress, raised him to the surface, and supported him towards the land. By the time they reached the shore, he could just stand on his legs. With the assistance of a policeman, Hilary enveloped him in garments and got him to a cab. He had regained some of his vitality, but did not seem aware of what had happened. "I was not in as long as usual," he mused as they passed out into the high road. "Oh, I think so, sir." Mr. Stone looked troubled. "It is odd," he said. "I do not recollect leaving the water." He did not speak again till he was being assisted from the cab. "I wish to recompense the man. I have half-a-crown indoors." "I will get it, sir," said Hilary. Mr. Stone, who shivered violently now that he was on his feet, turned his face up to the cabman. "Nothing is nobler than the horse," he said. "Take care of him." The cabman removed his hat. "I will, sir," he answered. Walking by himself, but closely watched by Hilary, Mr. Stone reached his room. He groped about him as though not distinguishing objects too well through the crystal clearness of the fundamental flux. "If I might advise you," said Harry, "I would get back into bed for a few minutes. You seem a little chilly." Mr. Stone, who was indeed shaking so that he could hardly stand, allowed Hilary to assist him into bed and tuck the blankets round him. "I must be at work at about 10 o'clock," he said. Hilary, who was also shivering, hastened to Bianca's room. She was just coming down and exclaimed at seeing him all wet. When he had told her of the episode, she touched his shoulder. "What about you?" "A hot bath and drink will set me right. You'd better go to him." He turned towards the bathroom, where Miranda stood lifting a white foot. Compressing her lips, Bianca ran downstairs. Startled by his tale, she would have taken his wet body in her arms, if the ghosts of innumerable moments had not stood between. So this moment passed too, and itself became a ghost. Mr. Stone, greatly to his disgust, had not succeeded in resuming work at 10 o'clock. Failing simply because he could not stand on his legs, he had announced his intention of waiting until 3:30, when he should get up in preparation for the coming of the little girl. Having refused to see a doctor or have his temperature taken, it was impossible to tell precisely what degree of fever he was in. In his cheeks, just visible over the blankets, there was more colour than there should have been, and his eyes, fixed on the ceiling, shone with suspicious brilliancy. To the dismay of Bianca, who sat as far out of sight as possible lest he should see her and fancy that she was doing him a service, he pursued his thoughts aloud. "Words, words, they have taken away brotherhood." Bianca shuddered, listening to that uncanny sound. "In those days of words they called it death, pale death, mors pallida. They saw the word like a gigantic granite block suspended over them and slowly coming down. Some, turning up their faces at the sight, trembled painfully, awaiting their obliteration. Others, unable while they still lived to face the thought of nothingness, inflated by some spiritual wind and thinking always of their individual forms, called out unceasingly that those selves of theirs would and must survive this word, that in some fashion which no man could understand, each self-conscious entity reaccumulated after distribution. Drunk with this thought, these too passed away. Some waited for it with grim, dry eyes, remarking that the process was molecular, and thus they also met their so-called death." His voice ceased, and in place of it rose the sound of his tongue moistening his palate. Bianca, from behind, placed a glass of barley water to his lips. He drank it with a slow, clucking noise. Then, seeing that a hand held the glass, said, "Is that you? Are you ready for me? Follow. In those days no one leaped up to meet pale, riding death. No one saw in his face that she was brotherhood incarnate. No one with a heart as light as gossamer kissed her feet, and smiling passed into the universe." His voice died away. When next he spoke, it was in a quick, husky whisper. I must. I must. There was silence. Then he added, Give me my trousers. Bianca placed them by his bed. The sight seemed to reassure him. He was once more silent. For more than an hour after this he was so absolutely still that Bianca rose continually to look at him. Each time his eyes, wide open, were fixed on a little dark mark across the ceiling. His face had a look of the most singular determination, as though his spirit were slowly, relentlessly regaining mastery over his fevered body. He spoke suddenly. Who is there? Bianca. Help me out of bed. The flush had left his face. The brilliance had faded from his eyes. He looked just like a ghost. With a sort of terror, Bianca helped him out of bed. The weird display of mute white willpower was unearthly. When he was dressed in his woolen gown and seated before the fire, she gave him a cup of strong beef tea with brandy. He swallowed it with great avidity. I should like some more of that, he said, and fell asleep. While he was asleep, Cecilia came, and the two sisters watched his slumber, and, watching it, felt nearer to each other than they had for many years. Before she went away, Cecilia whispered, Bee, if he seems to want that little girl while he's like this, don't you think she ought to come? Bianca answered, I don't know where she is. I do. Ah, said Bianca, of course. And she turned her head away. Disconcerted by that sarcastic little speech, Cecilia was silent. Then, summoning all her courage, she said, Here's the address, Bee. I've written it down for you. And with puckers of anxiety in her face, she left the room. Bianca sat on in the old golden chair, watching the deep hollows beneath the sleeper's temples, the puffs of breath stirring the silver round his mouth. Her ears burned crimson. Carried out of herself by the sight of that old form, dearer to her than she had thought, fighting its great battle for the sake of its idea, her spirit grew all tremulous and soft within her. With eagerness she embraced the thought of self-effacement. It did not seem to matter whether she were first with Hilary. Her spirit should so manifest its capacity for sacrifice that she would be first with him through sheer nobility. At this moment she could almost have taken that common little girl into her arms and kissed her. So would all disquiet end. Some harmonious messenger had fluttered to her for a second, the gold-winged bird of peace. In this sensuous exultation her nerves vibrated like the strings of a violin. When Mr. Stone woke, it was past 3 o'clock, and Bianca at once handed him another cup of strong beef tea. He swallowed it and said, What is this? Beef tea. Mr. Stone looked at the empty cup. I must not drink it. The cow and the sheep are on the same plane as man. But how do you feel, dear? I feel, said Mr. Stone, able to dictate what I have already written, not more. Has she come? Not yet, but I will go and find her if you like. Mr. Stone looked at his daughter wistfully. That will be taking up your time, he said. Bianca answered, My time is of no consequence. Mr. Stone stretched his hands out to the fire. I will not consent, he said, evidently to himself, to be a drag on anyone. If that has come, then I must go. Bianca, placing herself beside him on her knees, pressed her hot cheek against his temple. But it has not come, Dad. I hope not, said Mr. Stone. I wish to end my book first. The sudden, grim coherence of his last two sayings terrified Bianca more than all his feverish utterances. I rely on you sitting quite still, she said, while I go and find her. And with a feeling in her heart as though two hands had seized and were pulling it asunder, she went out. Some half-hour later, Hilary slipped quietly in and stood watching at the door. Mr. Stone, seated on the very verge of his armchair, with his hands on its arms, was slowly rising to his feet and slowly falling back again, not once, but many times, practising a standing posture. As Henry came into his line of sight, he said, "I have succeeded twice." "I'm very glad," said Henry. "Won't you rest now, sir?" "It is my knees," said Mr. Stone. "She's gone to find her." Henry heard those words with bewilderment, and sitting down on the other chair, waited. "I have fancied," said Mr. Stone, looking at him wistfully, "that when we pass away from life we may become the wind. Is that your opinion?" "It is a new thought to me," said Henry. "It is not tenable," said Mr. Stone, "but it is restful. The wind is everywhere and nowhere, and nothing can be hidden from it. When I have missed that little girl, I have tried, in a sense, to become the wind, but I found it difficult." His eyes left Hilary's face, whose mournful smile he had not noticed, and fixed themselves on the bright fire. "In those days," he said, "men's relation to the eternal airs was the relation of a billion little separate draughts blowing against the south-west wind. They did not wish to merge themselves in that soft moon-uttered sigh, but blew in its face through crevices and cracks and keyholes, and were borne away on the pellucid journey, whistling out their protests." He again tried to stand, evidently wishing to get to his desk to record this thought, but, failing, looked painfully at Hilary. He seemed about to ask for something, but checked himself. "If I practice hard," he murmured, "I shall master it." Hilary rose and brought him paper and a pencil. In bending, he saw that Mr. Stone's eyes were dim with moisture. This sight affected him so that he was glad to turn away and fetch a book to form a writing-pad. When Mr. Stone had finished, he sat back in his chair with closed eyes. A supreme silence reigned in the bare room above those two men of different generations and of such strange dissimilarity of character. Hilary broke that silence. "I heard the cuckoo sing today," he said almost in a whisper, lest Mr. Stone should be asleep. "The cuckoo," replied Mr. Stone, "has no sense of brotherhood." "I forgive him for his song," murmured Hilary. "His song," said Mr. Stone, "is alluring. It excites the sexual instinct." Then to himself he added, "She has not come as yet." Even as he spoke there was heard by Hilary a faint tapping on the door. He rose and opened it. The little model stood outside. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 29. Return of the Little Model. That same afternoon in High Street, Kensington, Westminster, with his coat collar raised against the inclement wind, his old hat spotted with rain, was drawing at a clay pipe and fixing his iron-rimmed gaze on those who passed him by. It had been a day when singularly few as yet had bought from him his faintly green-tinged journal, and the low class of fellow who sold the other evening prints had especially exasperated him. His single mind, always torn to some extent between an ingrained loyalty to his employers and those politics of his which differed from his papers, had vented itself twice since coming on his stand. Once in these words to the seller of Pall Malls: "I stipulated with you not to come beyond the lamp-post. Don't you never speak to me again, and crowdy of me off my stand." And once to the younger vendors of the less expensive journals, thus: "Oh, you boys, I'll make you regret of it, a snapping up my customers under me very nose. Wait until you're old." To which the boys had answered, "All right, Daddy, don't you have a fit. You'd be a deader soon enough without that, you know." It was now his time for tea, but Pall Mall having gone to partake of this refreshment, he waited on, hoping against hope to get a customer or two of that low fellow's. And while in black insulation he stood there, a timid voice said at his elbow, "Mr. Creed?" The aged butler turned and saw the little model. "Oh," he said dryly, "it's you, is it?" His mind, with its incessant love of rank, knowing that she earned her living as a handmaid to that disorderly establishment, the House of Art, had from the first classed her as lower than a lady's maid. Recent events had made him think of her unkindly. Her new clothes, which he had not been privileged to see before, while giving him a sense of Sunday, deepened his moral doubts. "Where are you living now?" he said in tones incorporating these feelings. "I'm not to tell you." "Oh, very well, keep yourself to yourself." The little model's lower lip drooped more than ever. There were dark marks beneath her eyes. Her face was altogether rather pinched and pitiful. "Won't you tell me any news?" she said in her matter-of-fact voice. The old butler gave a strange grunt. "Ha!" he said. "The baby's dead and buried tomorrow." "Dead?" repeated the little model. "I'm a-going to the funeral, Brompton Cemetery. 9:30 I leave the door, and that's the beginning of the end. The man's in prison and the woman's gone a shudder of herself." The little model rubbed her hands against her skirt. "What did he go to prison for?" "For assaulting of her. I was witness to his battery." "Why did he assault her?" Creed looked at her, and wagging his head answered, "That's best known to them as caused of it." The little model's face went to the colour of carnations. "I can't help what he does," she said. "What should I want him for, a man like that? It wouldn't be him I'd want." Genuine contempt in that sharp burst of anger impressed the aged butler. "I'm not saying anything," he said. "It's all one to me. I never mixes up with no other people's business. But it's very ill convenient. I don't get me proper breakfast. That poor woman, she's half off her head. When the baby's buried, I'll have to go and look out for another room before he gets to coming out." "I hope they'll keep him there," muttered the little model suddenly. "They give him a month," said Creed. "Only a month?" The old butler looked at her. "There's more stuff in you," he seemed to say, "than ever I had thought." "Because of his serving of his country," he remarked aloud. "I'm sorry about the poor little baby," said the little model in her stolid voice. Westminster shook his head. "I never suspected him of going to live," he said. The girl, biting the fingertip of her white cotton glove, was staring out at the traffic. Like a pale ray of light entering the now dim cavern of the old man's mind, the thought came to Creed that he did not quite understand her. He had in his time had occasion to class many young persons, and the feeling that he did not quite know her class of person was like the sensation a bat might have, surprised by daylight. Suddenly, without saying good-bye to him, she walked away. "Well," he thought, looking after her, "your manners ain't improved by where you're living, nor your appearance neither, for all your new clothes." And for some time he stood thinking of the stare in her eyes and that abrupt departure. Through the crystal clearness of the fundamental flux, the mind could see at that same moment Bianca leaving her front gate. Her sensuous exaltation, her tremulous longing after harmony, had passed away. In her heart, strangely mingled, were these two thoughts: "If only she were a lady," and "I'm glad she is not a lady." Of all the dark and tortuous places of this life, the human heart is the most dark and tortuous. And of all human hearts, none are less clear, more intricate than the hearts of all that class of people among whom Bianca had her being. Pride was a simple quality when joined with a simple view of life based on the plain philosophy of property. Pride was no simple quality when the 100 paralysing doubts and aspirations of a social conscience also hedged it round. In thus going forth with the full intention of restoring the little model to her position in the household, her pride fought against her pride, and her woman's sense of ownership in the man whom she had married wrestled with the acquired sentiments of freedom, liberality, equality, good taste. With her spirit thus confused, and her mind so at variance with itself, she was really acting on the simple instinct of compassion. She had run upstairs from Mr. Stone's room, and now walked fast, lest that instinct, the most physical perhaps of all, awakened by sights and sounds and requiring constant nourishment, should lose its force. Rapidly then she made her way to the grey street in Bayswater, where Cecilia had told her that the girl now lived. The tall, gaunt landlady admitted her. "Have you a Miss Barton lodging here?" Bianca asked. "Yes," said the lady, "but I think she's out." She looked into the little model's room. "Yes," she said, "she's out. We'd like to leave a note you could write in here. If you're looking for a model, she wants work, I believe." That modern faculty of pressing on an aching nerve was assuredly not lacking in Bianca. To enter the girl's room was jabbing at the nerve indeed. She looked round her. The mental vacuity of that little room! There was not one single thing, with the exception of a torn copy of Titbits, which suggested that a mind of any sort lived there. For all that, perhaps because of that, it was neat enough. "Yes," said the landlady, "she keeps her room tidy. Of course she's a country girl, comes from down my way." She said this with a dry twist of her grim, but not unkindly, features. "If it weren't for that," she went on, "I don't think I should care to let to one of her profession." Her hungry eyes, gazing at Bianca, had in them the aspirations of all nonconformity. Bianca pencilled on her card. "If you can come to my father today or tomorrow, please do." "Will you give her this, please? It will be quite enough." "I'll give it her," the landlady said. "She'll be glad of it, I dare say. I see her sitting here. Girls like that, if they've got nothing to do. See, she's been moping on her bed." The impress of a form was indeed clearly visible on the red and yellow tasselled tapestry of the bed. Bianca cast a look at it. "Thank you," she said. "Good day." With the jabbed nerve aching badly, she came slowly homewards. Before the garden gate, the little model herself was gazing at the house, as if she had been there some time. Approaching from across the road, Bianca had an admirable view of that young figure, now very trim and neat, yet with something in its lines, more supple perhaps, but less refined, which proclaimed her not a lady, a something fundamentally undisciplined, or disciplined by the material facts of life alone, rather than by a secret creed of voluntary rules. It showed here and there in ways women alone could understand, above all in the way her eyes looked out on that house which she was clearly longing to enter. Not "shall I go in" was in that look, but "dare I go in?" Suddenly she saw Bianca. The meeting of these two was very like the ordinary meeting of a mistress and her maid. Bianca's face had no expression except the faint, distant curiosity which seemed to say, "You are a sealed book to me. I have always found you so. What you really think and do, I shall never know." The little model's face wore a half caught out, half stolid look. "Please go in," Bianca said. "My father will be glad to see you." She held the garden gate open for the girl to pass through. Her feeling at that moment was one of slight amusement at the futility of her journey. Not even this small piece of generosity was permitted her, it seemed. "How are you getting on?" The little model made an impulsive movement at such an unexpected question. Checking it at once, she answered, "Very well, thank you. That is, not very." "You will find my father tired today. He has caught a chill. Don't let him read too much, please." The little model seemed to try and nerve herself to make some statement, but, failing, passed into the house. Bianca did not follow, but stole back into the garden, where the sun was still falling on a bed of wallflowers at the far end. She bent down over these flowers till her veil touched them. 2 wild bees were busy there, buzzing with smoky wings, clutching with their black tiny legs at the orange petals, plunging their black tiny tongues far down into the honeyed centres. The flowers quivered beneath the weight of their small, dark bodies. Bianca's face quivered too, bending close to them, not making the slightest difference to their hunt. Hilary, who, it has been seen, lived in thoughts about events rather than events themselves, and to whom crude acts and words had little meaning save in relation to what philosophy could make of them, greeted with a startled movement the girl's appearance in the corridor outside Mr. Stone's apartment. But the little model, who mentally lived very much from hand to mouth, and had only the philosophy of wants, acted differently. She knew that for the last 5 days, like a spaniel dog shut away from where it feels it ought to be, she wanted to be where she was now standing. She knew that in her new room with its rust-red doors, She had bitten her lips and fingers till blood came, and, as newly caged birds will flutter, had beaten her wings against those walls with blue roses on a yellow ground. She remembered how she had lain, brooding, on that piece of red and yellow tapestry, twisting its tassels, staring through half-closed eyes at nothing. There was something different in her look at Hilary. It had lost some of its childish devotion. It was bolder, as if she had lived and felt, and brushed a good deal more down off her wings during those few days. "Mrs. Dennison told me to come," she said. "I thought I might. Mr. Creed told me about him being in prison." Hilary made way for her, and, following her into Mr. Stone's presence, shut the door. The truant has returned," he said. Hearing himself called so unjustly by that name, the little model gushed deeply and tried to speak. She stopped at the smile on Hilary's face and gazed from him to Mr. Stone and back again, the victim of mingled feelings. Mr. Stone was seen to have risen to his feet and to be very slowly moving towards his desk. He leaned both arms on his papers for support and, seeming to gather strength, began sorting out his manuscript. Through the open window the distant music of a barrel organ came drifting in. Faint and much too slow was the sound of the waltz it played, but there was invitation, allurement, in that tune. The little model turned towards it, and Hilary looked hard at her. The girl and that sound together, there, quite plain, was the music he had heard for many days, like a man lying with the touch of fever on him. "Are you ready?" said Mr. Stone. The little model dipped her pen in ink. Her eyes crept towards the door, where Hilary was still standing with the same expression on his face. He avoided her eyes and went up to Mr. Stone. "Must you read today, sir?" Mr. Stone looked at him with anger. "Why not?" he said. "You are hardly strong enough." Mr. Stone raised his manuscript. "We are 3 days behind." Very slowly he began dictating. "Barbarous habits in those days, such as the custom known as war." His voice died away. It was apparent that his elbows, leaning on the desk, alone prevented his collapse. Hilary moved the chair, and taking him beneath the arms, lowered him gently into it. Noticing that he was seated, Mr. Stone raised his manuscript and read on. "Were pursued regardless of fraternity. It was as though a herd of horned cattle driven through green pastures to that gate, where they must meet with certain dissolution, had set about to prematurely gore and disembowel each other, out of a passionate devotion to those individual shapes which they were so soon to lose. So men, tribe against tribe, and country against country, glared across the valleys with their ensanguined eyes. They could not see the moonlit wings or feel the embalming airs of brotherhood." Slower and slower came his sentences, and as the last word died away he was heard to be asleep, breathing through a tiny hole left beneath the eave of his moustache. Hilary, who had waited for that moment, gently put the manuscript on the desk and beckoned to the girl. He did not ask her to his study, but spoke to her in the hall. "While Mr. Stone is like this, he misses you. You will come then, at present, please, so long as Hughes is in prison. How do you like your room?" The little model answered simply, "Not very much." "Why not?" "It's lonely there. Shan't mind now I'm coming here again." "Only for the present," was all Hilary could find to say. The little model's eyes were lowered. "Mrs. Hughes' baby's to be buried tomorrow," she said suddenly. "Where?" "In Brompton Cemetery. Mr. Creed's going." "What time is the funeral?" The girl looked up stealthily. "Mr. Creed's going to start at 9:30. "I should like to go myself," said Hilary. A gleam of pleasure passing across her face was instantly obscured behind the cloud of her stolidity. Then, as she saw Hilary move nearer to the door, her lip began to droop. "Well, good-bye," he said. The little model flushed and quivered. "You don't even look at me," she seemed to say. "You haven't spoken kindly to me once." And suddenly she said in a hard voice, "No, I shan't go to Mr. Leonard's any more." "Oh, then you have been to him?" Triumph at attracting his attention, fear of what she had admitted, supplication and half-defiant shame, all this was in her face. "Yes," she said. Hilary did not speak. "I didn't care any more when you told me I wasn't to come here." Still Hilary did not speak. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, with tears in her voice. "No, no," said Hilary, "of course not." The little model choked. "It's my profession." Yes, yes," said Hilary, "it's all right." "I don't care what he thinks. I won't go again so long as I can come here." Hilary touched her shoulder. "Well, well," he said, and opened the front door. The little model, tremulous, like a flower kissed by the sun after rain, went out with a light in her eyes. The master of the house returned to Mr. Stone. Long he sat looking at the old man's slumber. A thinker meditating upon action. So might Hilary's figure, with its thin face resting on its hand, a furrow between the brows, and that painful smile, have been entitled in any catalogue of statues. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Owens. Chapter 30. Funeral of a Baby. Following out the instinct planted so deeply in human nature for treating with the utmost care and at great expense, when dead, those who when alive have been served with careless parsimony, there started from the door of number 1 in Hound Street a funeral procession of 3 four-wheeled cabs. The first bore the little coffin, on which lay a great white wreath, gift of Cecilia and time. The second bore Mrs. Hughes, her son Stanley, and Joshua Creed. The third bore Martin Stone. In the first cab, silence was presiding, with the scent of lilies over him who in his short life had made so little noise, the small grey shadow which had crept so quietly into being, and, taking his chance when he was not noticed, had crept so quietly out again. Never had he felt so restful, so much at home, as in that little common coffin, washed as he was to an unnatural whiteness, and wrapped in his mother's only spare sheet. Away from all the strife of men he was journeying to a greater peace. His little aloe plant had flowered, and between the open windows of the only carriage he had ever been inside, the wind, which who knows he had perhaps become, stirred the fronds of fern and the flowers of his funeral wreath. Thus he was going from that world where all men were his brothers. From the second cab the same wind was rigidly excluded, and there was silence broken by the aged butler's breathing. Dressed in his Newmarket coat, he was recalling with a certain sense of luxury past journeys in four-wheeled cabs, occasions when, seated beside a box corded and secured with sealing wax, he had taken his master's plate for safety to the bank, occasions when, under a roof piled up with guns and boxes, he had sat holding the Honourable Bateson's dog, occasions when, with some young person by his side, he had driven at the tail of a baptismal, nuptial, or funeral cortege. These memories of past grandeur came back to him with curious poignancy, and for some reason the words kept rising in his mind, for richer or poorer, for better or worser, in health and in sick places, till death do us part. But in the midst of the exaltation of these recollections, the old heart beneath his old red-flannelled chest-protector, that companion of his exile, twittering faintly at short intervals, made him look at the woman by his side. He longed to convey to her some little of the satisfaction he felt in the fact that this was by no means the low class of funeral it might have been. He doubted whether, with her woman's mind, she was getting all the comfort she could out of 3 four-wheeled cabs and a wreath of lilies. The seamstress's thin face, with its pinched, passive look, was indeed thinner, quieter than ever. What she was thinking of he could not tell. There were so many things she might be thinking of. She too, no doubt, had seen her grandeur, if but in the solitary drive away from the church, where, 8 years ago, she and Hughes had listened to the words now haunting Creed, of her lost youth and comeliness, and her man's dead love, of the long descent to Shadowland, of the other children she had buried, of Hughes in prison, of the girl that had put a spell on him, or only of the last precious tugs the tiny lips at rest in the first four-wheeled cab had given at her breast? Or was she, with a nicer feeling for proportion, reflecting that, had not people been so kind, she might have had to walk behind a funeral provided by the parish? The old butler could not tell. But he, whose one desire now, coupled with the wish to die outside a workhouse, was to save enough to bury his own body without the interference of other people, was inclined to think she must be dwelling on the brighter side of things, and, designing to encourage her, he said, "Wonderful improvement in these here four-wheeled cabs. Oh dear, yes. I remember of them where they were the shadows of what they are at the present time of speaking." The seamstress answered in her quiet voice, "Very comfortable this is. Sit still, Stanley." Her little son, whose feet did not reach the floor, was drumming his heels against the seat. He stopped and looked at her, and the old butler addressed him. "You'll remember of this occasion," he said, "when you gets older." The little boy turned his black eyes from his mother to him who had spoken last. "It's a beautiful reef," continued Creed. "I could smell of it all the way up the stairs. There's been no expense spared. There's white laylock in it. That's a class of flower that's very extravagant." A train of thought having been roused too strong for his discretion, he added, "I saw that young girl yesterday. She came interrogating of me in the street." On Mrs. Hughes' face, where till now expression had been buried, came such a look as one may see on the face of an owl, hard, watchful, cruel, harder, more cruel, for the softness of the big dark eyes. "She'd show a better feeling," she said, "to keep a quiet tongue. Sit still, Stanley." Once more the little boy stopped drumming his heels and shifted his stare from the old butler back to her who spoke. The cab, which had seemed to hesitate and start as though jibbing at something in the road, resumed its ambling pace. Creed looked through the well-closed window. There, before him, so long that it seemed to have no end, like a building in a nightmare, stretched that place where he did not mean to end his days. He faced towards the horse again. The colour had deepened in his nose. He spoke. "If they'd have given me my last edition earlier, instead of sending it down after that low-class fellow's taken all my customers, that made a difference to me of 2 shillings at the utmost in my week, and all clear savings." To these words, dark with hidden meaning, he received no answer save the drumming of the small boy's heels, and, reverting to the subject he had been distracted from, he murmured, "She was a-weary of new clothes." He was startled by the fierce tone of a voice he hardly knew. "I don't want to hear about her. She's not for decent folk to talk of." The old butler looked round askance. The seamstress was trembling violently. Her fierceness at such a moment shocked him. Dust to dust, he thought. "Don't you be considerate of it," he said at last, summoning all his knowledge of the world. "She'll come to her own place." And at the sight of a slow tear trickling over her burning cheek, he added hurriedly, "Think of your baby. I'll see you through. Sit still, little boy, sit still. You're disturbing of your mother." Once more the little boy stayed the drumming of his heels to look at him who spoke, and the closed cab rolled on with its slow, jingling sound. In the third four-wheeled cab, where the windows again were wide open, Martin Stone, with his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his coat and his long legs crossed, sat staring at the roof with a sort of twisted scorn on his pale face. Just inside the gate through which had passed in their time so many dead and living shadows, Hilary stood waiting. He could probably not have explained why he had come to see this tiny shade committed to the earth. In memory perhaps of those 2 minutes when the baby's eyes had held parley with his own, or in the wish to pay mute respect to her on whom life had weighed so hard of late. For whatever reason he had come, he was keeping quietly to one side. And, unobserved, he too had his watcher, the little model, sheltering behind a tall grave. 2 men in rusty black bore the little coffin. Then came the white-robed chaplain, then Mrs. Hughes and her little son. Close behind, his head thrust forward with trembling movements from side to side, old Creed. And last of all, young Martin Stone. Hilary joined the young doctor. So the 5 mourners walked. Before a small dark hole in a corner of the cemetery, they stopped. On this forest of unflowered graves, the sun was falling. The east wind, with its faint reek, touched the old butler's plastered hair and brought moisture to the corners of his eyes, fixed with absorption on the chaplain. Words and thoughts hunted in his mind. He's getting Christian burial. Who'll give this woman away? I do. Ashes to ashes. I never suspected him of living. The conning of the burial service, shortened to fit the passing of that tiny shade, gave him pleasurable sensation. Films came down on his eyes. He listened like some old parrot on its perch, his head a little to one side. Them as dies young, he thought, goes straight to heaven. We trusts in God, all mortal men, his godfathers and his godmothers in his baptism. Well, so it is. I'm not afeard to death. Seeing the little coffin tremble above the hole, he craned his head still further forward. It sank. A smothered sobbing rose. The old butler touched the arm in front of him with shaking fingers. Don't he whispered. He's a-gone to glory. But hearing the dry rattle of the earth, he took out his own handkerchief and put it to his nose. Yes, he's a-gone, he thought. Another little baby. Old men and maidens, young men and little children. It's going on all the time. Where he is now, there'll be no marrying. No, nor giving out in marriage, till death us do part. The wind, sweeping across the filled-in hole, carried the rustle of his husky breathing, the dry, smothered sobbing of the sempstress, out across the shallows' graves, to those places, to those streets. From the baby's funeral, Hilary and Martin walked away together, and far behind them, across the road, the little model followed. For some time neither spoke. Then Hilary, stretching out his hand towards a squalid alley, said, They haunt us and drag us down. A long, dark passage. Is there a light at the far end, Martin? Yes, said Martin gruffly. I don't see it. Martin looked at him. Hamlet. Hilary did not reply. The young man watched him sideways. It's a disease to smile like that. Hilary ceased to smile. Kill me then, he said with sudden anger, you man of health. The young senatist's sallow cheeks flushed. Atrophy of the nerve of action, he muttered. There's no cure for that. Ah, said Hilary. All kinds of us want social progress in our different ways. You, your grandfather, my brother, myself. There are 4 types for you. Will you tell me any one of us is the right man for the job? For instance, action's not natural to me. Any act, answered Martin, is better than no act. A myope is natural to you, Martin. Your prescription in this case has not been too successful, has it? I can't help it if people will be damned fools. There you hit it. But answer me this question. Isn't a social conscience, broadly speaking, the result of comfort and security? Martin shrugged his shoulders. And doesn't comfort also destroy the power of action? Again Martin shrugged. Then If those who have the social conscience and can see what is wrong have lost their power of action, how can you say there is any light at the end of this dark passage? Martin took his pipe out, filled it, and pressed the filling with his thumb. There is light, he said at last, in spite of all invertebrates. Goodbye, I've wasted enough time. And he abruptly strode away. And in spite of myopia? Muttered Hilary. A few minutes later, coming out from Messrs. Rose and Thorns, where he had gone to buy tobacco, he came suddenly on the little model, evidently waiting. I was at the funeral, she said, and her voice added plainly, I followed you. Uninvited, she walked on at his side. This is not the same girl, he thought, that I sent away 5 days ago. She has lost something, gained something. I don't know her. There seemed such a stubborn purpose in her face and manner. It was like the look in a dog's eyes that says, Master, you thought to shut me up away from you. I know now what that is like. Do what you will. I mean in future to be near you. This look, by its simplicity, frightened one to whom the primitive was strange. Desiring to free himself of his companion, yet not knowing how, Hilary sat down in Kensington Gardens on the first bench they came to. The little model sat down beside him. The quiet siege laid to him by this girl was quite uncanny. It was as though someone were binding him with toy threads, swelling slowly into ropes before his eyes. In this fear of Hilary's there was at first much irritation. His fastidiousness and sense of the ridiculous were roused. What did this little creature, with whom he had no thoughts and no ideas in common, whose spirit and his could never hope to meet, think that she could get from him? Was she trying to weave a spell over him too, with her mute, stubborn adoration? Was she trying to change his protective weakness for her to another sort of weakness? He turned and looked. She dropped her eyes at once, and sat still as a stone figure. As in her spirit, so in her body she was different. Her limbs looked freer, rounder, her breath seemed stirring her more deeply. Like a flower of early June, she was opening before his very eyes. This, though it gave him pleasure, also added to his fear. The strange silence in its utter naturalness, for what could he talk about with her, brought home to him more vividly than anything before the barriers of class. All he thought of was how not to be ridiculous. She was inviting him in some strange, unconscious, subtle way to treat her as a woman, as though in spirit she had linked her round young arms about his neck, and through her half-closed lips were whispering the eternal call of sex to sex. And he, a middle-aged and cultivated man, conscious of everything, could not even speak for fear of breaking through his shell of delicacy. He hardly breathed, disturbed to his very depths by the young figure sitting by his side, and by the dread of showing that disturbance. Beside the cultivated plant, the self-sown poppy rears itself. Round the stem of a smooth tree, the honeysuckle twines. To a trim wall, the ivy clings. In her new-found form and purpose, this girl had gained a strange, still power. She no longer felt it mattered whether he spoke or looked at her. Her instinct, piercing through his shell, was certain of the throbbing of his pulses, the sweet poison in his blood. The perception of this still power, more than all else, brought fear to Hilary. He need not speak. She would not care. He need not even look at her. She had but to sit there silent, motionless, with the breath of youth coming through her parted lips, and the light of youth stealing through her half-closed eyes. And abruptly he got up and walked away. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evans. Chapter 31, Swan Song. The new wine, if it does not break the old bottle,
after fierce effervescence seethes and bubbles quietly. It was so in Mr. Stone's old bottle, hour by hour and day by day, throughout the month. A pinker, robuster look came to his cheeks. His blue eyes, fixed on distance, had in them more light. His knees regained their powers. He bathed, and all unknown to him, for he only saw the waters he cleaved with his ineffably slow stroke. Hilary and Martin, on alternate weeks, and keeping at a proper distance, for fear he should see them doing him a service, attended to that function, in case Mr. Stone should again remain too long seated at the bottom of the Serpentine. Each morning after his cocoa and porridge he could be heard sweeping out his room with extraordinary vigour, and, as 10 o'clock came near, anyone who listened would remark a sound of air escaping, as he moved up and down on his toes in preparation for the labours of the day. No letters, of course, nor any newspaper disturbed the supreme and perfect self-containment of this life devoted to fraternity. No letters, partly because he lacked a known address, partly because for years he had not answered them. And with regard to newspapers, once a month he went to a public library and could be seen with the last 4 numbers of 2 weekly reviews before him, making himself acquainted with the habits of those days, and moving his lips as though in prayer. At 10 each morning, anyone in the corridor outside his room was startled by the whir of an alarm clock. Perfect silence followed. Then rose a sound of shuffling, whistling, rustling, broken by sharply muttered words. Soon from this turbid lake of sound the articulate, thin fluting of an old man's voice streamed forth. This, alternating with the squeak of a quill pen, went on till the alarm clock once more went off. Then he who stood outside could smell that Mr. Stone should shortly eat. If, stimulated by that scent, he entered, he might see the author of the Book of Universal Brotherhood, with a baked potato in one hand and a cup of hot milk in the other. On the table, too, the ruined forms of eggs, tomatoes, oranges, bananas, figs, prunes, cheese, and honeycomb, which have passed into other forms already, together with a loaf of wholemeal bread. Mr. Stone would presently emerge in his cottage-woven tweeds and old hat of green-black felt, or, if wet, in a long coat of yellow gabardine and sou'wester cap of the same material, but always with a little osier fruit-bag in his hand. Thus equipped, he walked down to Rose and Thorns, entered, and to the first man he saw handed the osier fruit-bag, some coins, and a little book containing 7 leaves, headed Food, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so forth. He then stood looking through the pickles in some jar or other at things beyond, with one hand held out, fingers upwards, awaiting the return of his little osier fruit-bag. Feeling presently that it had been restored to him, he would turn and walk out of the shop. Behind his back, on the face of the department, the same protecting smile always rose. Long habit had perfected it. All now felt that, though so very different from themselves, this aged customer was dependent on them. By not one single farthing or one pale slip of cheese would they have defrauded him for all the treasures of the moon, and any new salesman who laughed at that old client was promptly told to shut his head. Mr. Stone's frail form, bent somewhat to one side by the increased gravamen of the osier bag, was now seen moving homewards. He arrived perhaps 10 minutes before the 3 o'clock alarum, and soon passing through preliminary chaos, the articulate, thin fluting of his voice streamed forth again, broken by the squeaking and spluttering of his quill. But towards 4 o'clock signs of cerebral excitement became visible. His lips would cease to utter sounds, his pen to squeak. His face, with a flushed forehead, would appear at the open window. As soon as the little model came in sight, her eyes fixed not on his window but on Hilary's, he turned his back, evidently waiting for her to enter by the door. His first words were uttered in a tranquil voice. "I have several pages. I have placed your chair. Are you ready? Follow." Except for that strange tranquillity of voice and the disappearance of the flush on his brow, there was no sign of the rejuvenescence that she brought. of such refreshment as steals on the traveller who sits down beneath a lime tree towards the end of a long day's journey. No sign of the mysterious comfort distilled into his veins by the sight of her moody young face, her young, soft limbs. So from simulant men very near their end will draw energy, watching, as it were, a shape beckoning them forward, till suddenly it disappears in darkness. In the quarter of an hour sacred to their tea and conversation, he never noticed that she was always listening for sounds beyond. It was enough that in her presence he felt singleness of purpose strong within him. When she had gone, moving languidly, moodily away, her eyes darting about for signs of Hilary, Mr. Stone would sit down rather suddenly and fall asleep, to dream perhaps of youth. Youth with its scent of sap, its close beckonings, youth with its hopes and fears, youth that hovers round us so long after it is dead. His spirit would smile behind its covering, that thin china of his face, and, as dogs hunting in their sleep work their feet, so he worked the fingers resting on his woollen knees. The 7 o'clock alarm woke him to the preparation of the evening meal. This eaten, he began once more to pace up and down, to pour words out into the silence, and to drive his squeaking quill. So was being written a book such as the world had never seen. But the girl who came so moodily to bring him refreshment, and went so moodily away, never in those days caught a glimpse of that which she was seeking. Since the morning when he had left her abruptly, Hilary had made a point of being out in the afternoons and not returning till past 6 o'clock. By this device he put off facing her and himself, for he could no longer refuse to see that he had himself to face. In the few minutes of utter silence when the girl sat beside him, magnetic, quivering with awakening force, he had found that the male in him was far from dead. It was no longer vague, sensuous feeling. It was warm, definite desire. The more she was in his thoughts, the less spiritual his feeling for this girl of the people had become. In those days he seemed much changed to such as knew him well. Instead of the delicate, detached, slightly humorous suavity which he had accustomed people to expect from him, the dry kindliness which seemed at once to check confidence and yet to say, "If you choose to tell me anything, I should never think of passing judgment on you, whatever you have done." Instead of that rather abstracted, faintly quizzical air, his manner had become absorbed and gloomy. He seemed to jib away from his friends. His manner at the Pen and Ink was wholly unsatisfying to men who liked to talk. He was known to be writing a new book. They suspected him of having got into a hat. This Victorian expression, found by Mr. Michaelides in some chronicle of post-Thackerayan manners, and revived by him in his incomparable way, as who should say, "What delicious expressions those good bourgeois had," now flourished in second childhood. In truth, Hilary's difficulty with his new book was merely the one of not being able to work at it at all. Even the housemaid who did his study noticed that day after day she was confronted by chapter 24, in spite of her employer staying in, as usual, every morning. A change in his manner and face, which had grown strained and harassed, had been noticed by Bianca, though she would have died sooner than admit she had noticed anything about him. It was one of those periods in the lives of households like an hour of a late summer's day, brooding, electric, and yet quiescent, but charged with the currents of coming storms. Twice only in those weeks, while Hughes was in prison, did Hilary see the girl. Once he met her when he was driving home. She blushed crimson and her eyes lighted up. And one morning, too, he passed her on the bench where they had sat together. She was staring straight before her, the corners of her mouth drooping discontentedly. She did not see him. To a man like Hilary, for whom running after women had been about the last occupation in the world, who had in fact always fought shy of them and imagined that they would always fight shy of him, there was an unusual enticement and dismay in the feeling that a young girl really was pursuing him. It was at once too good, too unlikely, and too embarrassing to be true. His sudden feeling for her was the painful sensation of one who sees a ripe nectarine hanging within reach. He dreamed continually of stretching out his hand, and so he did not dare, or thought he did not dare, to pass that way. All this did not favour the tenor of a studious, introspective life. It also brought a sense of unreality which made him avoid his best friends. This, partly, was why Stephen came to see him one Sunday, his other reason for the visit being the calculation that Hughes would be released on the following Wednesday. This girl, he thought, is going to the house still, and Henry will let things drift till he can't stop them, and there'll be a real mess. The fact of the man's having been in prison gave a sinister turn to an affair regarded hitherto as merely sordid by Stephen's orderly and careful mind. Crossing the garden, he heard Mr. Stone's voice issuing through the open window. Can't the old crank stop even on Sundays? He thought. He found Hilary in his study, reading a book on the civilization of the Maccabees, in preparation for a review. He gave Stephen but a dubious welcome. Stephen broke ground gently. We haven't seen you for an age. I hear our old friend at it. Is he working double time to finish his magnum opus? I thought he observed the day of rest. He does as a rule, said Hilary. Well, he's got the girl there, now, dictating. Hilary winced. Stephen continued with greater circumspection. You couldn't get the old boy to finish by Wednesday, I suppose. He must be quite near the end by now. The notion of Mr. Stone's finishing his book by Wednesday procured a pale smile from Hilary. Could you get your law courts, he said, to settle up the affairs of mankind for good and all by Wednesday? By Jove, is it as bad as that? I thought at any rate he must be meaning to finish some day. When men are brothers, said Hilary, he will finish. Stephen whistled. Look here, dear boy, he said, that ruffian comes out on Wednesday. The whole thing will begin over again. Hilary rose and paced the room. I refuse, he said, to consider Hughes a ruffian. What do we know about him, or any of them? Precisely. What do you know of this girl? I'm not going to discuss that, Hilary said shortly. For a moment the faces of the two brothers wore a hard, hostile look, as though the deep difference between their characters had at last got the better of their loyalty. They both seemed to recognise this, for they turned their heads away. I just wanted to remind you, Stephen said, that you know your own business best, of course. And as Hilary's nod, he thought, that's just exactly what he doesn't. He soon left, conscious of an unwonted awkwardness in his brother's presence. Hilary watched him out through the wicket gate, then sat down on the solitary garden bench. Stephen's visitor merely awakened perverse desires in him. Strong sunlight was falling on that little London garden, disclosing its native shadowiness. Streaks and smudges such as life smears over the faces of those who live too consciously. Hilary, beneath the acacia tree not yet in bloom, marked an early butterfly flitting over the geraniums blossoming round an old sundial. Blackbirds were holding evensong. The late perfume of the lilac came stealing forth into air faintly smeeched with chimney smoke. There was brightness, but no glory, in that little garden. Scent, but no strong air blown across golden lakes of buttercups from seas of springing clover or the wind-silver of young wheat. Music, but no full choir of sound, no hum. Like the face and figure of its master, so was this little garden, whose sundial the sun seldom reached, refined, self-conscious, introspective, obviously a creature of the town. At that moment, however, Hilary was not looking quite himself. His face was flushed, his eyes angry, almost as if he had been a man of action. The voice of Mr. Stone was still audible, fitfully quavering out into the air, and the old man himself could now and then be seen holding up his manuscript, his profile clear-cut against the darkness of the room. A sentence travelled out across the garden. Amidst the turbulent discoveries of those days, which, like cross-currented and multi-billowed seas, lapped and hollowed every rock. A motor car dashing past drowned the rest, and when the voice rose again it was evidently dictating another paragraph. In those places, in those streets, the shadows swarmed, whispering and droning like a hive of dying bees, who, their honey eaten, wander through the winter day seeking flowers that are frozen and dead. A great bee which had been busy with the lilac began to circle, booming, round his hair. Suddenly Hilary saw Mr. Stone raise both his arms. In huge congeries, crowded, devoid of light and air, they were assembled, these bloodless imprints from forms of higher caste. They lay like the reflection of leaves, which, fluttering free in the sweet winds, let fall to the earth worn resemblances. Imponderous dark ghosts, wandering ones, chained to the ground, they had no hope of any lovely city, nor knew whence they had come. Men cast them on pavements and marched on. They did not, in universal brotherhood, clasp their shadows to sleep within their hearts, for the sun was not then at noon, when no man has a shadow. As those words of swan song died away, he swayed and trembled, and suddenly disappeared below the sight line as if he had sat down. The little model took his place in the open window. She started at seeing Hilary, then, motionless, stood gazing at him. Out of the gloom of the opening her eyes were all pupil, 2 spots of the surrounding darkness imprisoned in a face as pale as any flower. Rigid as the girl herself, Hilary looked up at her. A voice behind him said, "How are you? I thought I'd give my car a run." Mr. Percy was coming from the gate, his eyes fixed on the window where the girl stood. "How is your wife?" he added. The bathos of this visit roused an acid fury in Hilary. He surveyed Mr. Percy's figure from his cloth-topped boots to his tall hat and said, "Shall we go in and find her?" As they went along, Mr. Percy said, "That's the model I met in your wife's studio, isn't it? Pretty girl." Hilary compressed his lips. "Now, what sort of living do those girls make?" pursued Mr. Percy. "I suppose that most of them are the resources. What?" "They make the living God will let them, I suppose, as other people do." Mr. Percy gave him a sharp look. It was almost as if Dallison had meant to snub him. "Exactly. I should think this girl would have no difficulty." Suddenly he saw a curious change come over that writing fellow, as he always afterwards described Hilary. Instead of a mild, pleasant-looking chap enough, he'd become a regular cold devil. "My wife appears to be out," Hilary said. "I also have an engagement." In his surprise and anger, Mr. Percy said with great simplicity, "Sorry I'm de trop." Soon his car could be heard bearing him away with some unnecessary noise. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 32. Behind Bianca's Veil. But Bianca was not out. She had been a witness of Hilary's long look at the little model. Coming from her studio through the glass passage to the house, she could not of course see what he was gazing at, but she knew as well as if the girl had stood before her in the dark opening of the window. Hating herself for having seen, she went to her room and lay on her bed with her hands pressed to her eyes. She was used to loneliness, that necessary lot of natures such as hers, but the bitter isolation of this hour was such as to drive even her lonely nature to despair. She rose at last and repaired the ravages made in her face and dress, lest anyone should see that she was suffering. Then, first making sure that Hilary had left the garden, she stole out. She wandered towards Hyde Park. It was Whitsuntide, a time of fear to the cultivated Londoner. The town seemed all arid jollity, and paper bags whirled on a dusty wind. People swarmed everywhere in clothes which did not suit them. Desultory, dead, tired creatures, who in these few green hours of leisure out of the sandy eternity of their toil were not suffered to rest, but were whipped on by starved instincts to hunt pleasures which they longed for too dreadfully to overtake. Bianca passed an old tramp asleep beneath a tree. His clothes had clung to him so long and lovingly that they were falling off, but his face was calm as though masked with the finest wax. Forgotten were his sores and sorrows. He was in the blessed fields of sleep. Bianca hastened away from the sight of such utter peace. She wandered into a grove of trees which had almost eluded the notice of the crowd. They were limes, guarding still within their honey bloom. Their branches of light broad leaves, near heart-shapes, were spread out like wide skirts. The tallest of these trees, a beautiful gay creature, stood tremulous, like a mistress waiting for her tardy lover. What joy she seemed to promise, what delicate enticement, with every veined, quivering leaf. And suddenly the sun caught hold of her, raised her up to him, kissed her all over. She gave forth a sigh of happiness, as though her very spirit had travelled through her lips up to her lover's heart. A woman in a lilac frock came stealing through the trees towards Bianca, and, sitting down not far off, kept looking quickly round under her sunshade. Presently Bianca saw what she was looking for. A young man in black coat and shining hat came swiftly up and touched her shoulder. Half hidden by the foliage they sat, leaning forward, prodding gently at the ground with stick and parasol. The stealthy murmur of their talk, so soft and intimate that no word was audible, stole across the grass, and secretly he touched her hand and arm. They were not of the holiday crowd, and had evidently chosen out this vulgar afternoon for a stolen meeting. Bianca rose and hurried on amongst the trees. She left the park. In the streets, many couples, not so careful to conceal their intimacy, were parading arm in arm. The sight of them did not sting her like the sight of those lovers in the park. They were not of her own order. But presently she saw a little boy and girl asleep on the doorstep of a mansion, with their cheeks pressed close together and their arms round each other. And again she hurried on. In the course of that long wandering she passed the building which Westminster was so anxious to avoid. In its gateway an old couple were just about to separate, one to the men's, the other to the women's quarters. Their toothless mouths were close together. "Well, good night, mother. Good night, father. Good night. Take care of yourself." Once more Bianca hurried on. It was past 9 when she turned into the old square and rang the bell of her sister's house with the sheer physical desire to rest somewhere that was not her home. At one end of the long and low drawing-room, Stephen, in evening dress, was reading aloud from a review. Cecilia was looking dubiously at his sock, where she seemed to see a tiny speck of white that might be Stephen. In the window at the far end, Time and Martin were exchanging speeches at short intervals. They made no move at Bianca's entrance, and their faces said, "We have no use for this hand-shaking nonsense." Receiving Cecilia's little warm, doubting kiss and Stephen's polite, dry handshake, Bianca motioned to him not to stop reading. He resumed. Cecilia, too, resumed her scrutiny of Stephen's sock. "Oh dear," she thought, "I know Bee's come here because she's unhappy. Poor thing, poor Hilary. It's that wretched business again, I suppose." Skilled in every tone of Stephen's voice, she knew that Bianca's entry had provoked the same train of thought in him. He seemed reading out these words: I disapprove. She's Sissy's sister, but if it wasn't for old Hilary I wouldn't have the subject in the house." Bianca, whose subtlety recorded every shade of feeling, could see that she was not welcome. Leaning back, with veil raised, she seemed listening to Stephen's reading, but in fact she was quivering at the sight of those two couples. Couples, for all but her. What crime had she committed? Why was the china of her cup flawed so that no one could drink from it? Why had she been made so that nobody could love her? This, the most bitter of all thoughts, the most tragic of all questionings, haunted her. The article which Stephen read, explaining exactly how to deal with people so that from one sort of human being they might become another, and going on to prove that if after this conversion they showed signs of a reversion, it would then be necessary to know the reason why, fell dryly on ears listening to that eternal question. Why is it with me as it is? It's not fair. Listening to the constant murmuring of her pride. I'm not wanted here or anywhere. Better to efface myself. From their end of the room, Time and Martin scarcely looked at her. To them she was Aunt B, an amateur, the mockery of whose eyes sometimes penetrated their youthful armour. They were, besides, too interested in their conversation to perceive that she was suffering. The skirmish of that conversation had lasted now for many days, ever since the death of the Hughes baby. "Well," Martin was saying, "what are you going to do? It's no good to base it on the baby. You must know your own mind all round. You can't go rushing into real work on mere sentiment." "You went to the funeral, Martin. It's bosh to say you didn't feel it too." Martin deigned no answer to this insinuation. "We've gone past the need for sentiment," he said. It's exploded. So is justice administered by an upper class with a patch over one eye and a squint in the other. When you see a dying donkey in a field, you don't want to refer the case to a society, as your dad would. You don't want an essay of Hilary's full of sympathy with everybody on walking in a field with reflections on the end of donkeys. You want to put a bullet in the donkey." "You're always down on Uncle Hilary," said Time. "I don't mind Hilary himself. I object to his type." "And he objects to yours," said Time. "I'm not so sure of that," said Martin slowly. "He hasn't got character enough." Time raised her chin, and looking at him through half-closed eyes, she said, "Well, I do think of all the conceited persons I ever met, you're the worst." Martin's nostril curled. "Are you prepared," he said, "to put a bullet in the donkey, or are you not?" "I only see one donkey, and not a dying one." Martin stretched out his hand and gripped her arm below the elbow. Retaining it luxuriously, he said, "Don't wander." Time tried to free her arm. "Let go." Martin was looking straight into her eyes. A flush had risen in his cheeks. Time, too, went to the colour of the old rose curtain behind which she sat. "Let go." "I won't. I'll make you know your mind. What do you mean to do? Are you coming in a fit of sentiment, or do you mean business?" Suddenly, half hypnotized, the young girl ceased to struggle. Her face had the strangest expression of submission and defiance, a sort of pain, a sort of delight. So they sat full half a minute staring at each other's eyes. Hearing a rustling sound, they looked and saw Bianca moving to the door. Cecilia, too, had risen. "What is it, Bee?" Bianca, opening the door, went out. Cecilia followed swiftly, too late to catch even a glimpse of her sister's face behind the veil. In Mr. Stone's room the green lamp burned dimly, and he who worked by it was sitting on the edge of his camp bed, attired in his old brown woollen gown and slippers. And suddenly it seemed to him that he was not alone. "I have finished for tonight," he said. "I am waiting for the wound to rise. She's nearly full. I shall see her face from here." A form sat down by him on the bed, and a voice said softly, "Like a woman's." Mr. Stone saw his younger daughter. "You have your hat on. Are you going out, my dear?" "I saw your light as I came in." "The moon," said Mr. Stone, "is an arid desert. Love is unknown there." "How can you bear to look at her, then?" Bianca whispered. Mr. Stone raised his finger. "She has risen." A wan moon had slipped out into the darkness. A light stole across the garden and through the open window to the bed where they were sitting. "Where there is no love, Dad," Bianca said, "there can be no life, can there?" Mr. Stone's eyes seemed to drink the moonlight. "That," he said, "is the great truth. The bed is shaking." With her arms pressed tight across her breast, Bianca was struggling with violent, noiseless sobbing. That desperate struggle seemed to be tearing her to death before his eyes. Mr. Stone sat silent, trembling. He knew not what to do. From his frosted heart, years of universal brotherhood had taken all knowledge of how to help his daughter. He could only sit touching her tremulously with thin fingers. The form beside him, whose warmth he felt against his arm, grew stiller, as though, in spite of its own loneliness, his helplessness had made it feel that he, too, was lonely. It pressed a little closer to him. The moonlight, gaining pale mastery over the flickering lamp, filled the whole room. Mr. Stone said, "I want her mother." The form beside him ceased to struggle. Finding out an old, forgotten way, Mr. Stone's arms slid round that quivering body. "I do not know what to say to her," he muttered, and slowly he began to rock himself. "Motion," he said, "is soothing." The moon passed on. The form beside him sat so still that Mr. Stone ceased moving. His daughter was no longer sobbing. Suddenly her lips seared his forehead. Trembling from that desperate caress, he raised his fingers to the spot and looked round. She was gone. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 33. Hilary deals with the situation. To understand the conduct of Hilary and Bianca at what Westminster would have called this Chrysax, not only their feelings as sentient human beings, but their matrimonial philosophy must be taken into account. By education and environment, they belonged to a section of society which had, in those days, abandoned the more old-fashioned views of marriage. Such as composed this section, finding themselves in opposition not only to the orthodox proprietary creed, but even to their own legal rights, have been driven to an attitude of almost blatant freedom. Like all folk in opposition, they were bound, as a simple matter of principle, to disagree with those in power, to view with a contemptuous resentment that majority which said, "I believe the thing is mine, and mine it shall remain," a majority which by force of numbers made this creed the law. Unable legally to be other than the proprietors of wife or husband, as the case might be, they were obliged, even in the most happy unions, to be very careful not to become disgusted with their own position. Their legal status was, as it were, a goad, spurring them on to show their horror of it. They were like children sent to school with trousers that barely reached their knees, aware that they could neither reduce their stature to the proportions of their breeches, nor make their breeches grow. They were furnishing an instance of that immemorial change of form to form, to which Mr. Stone had given the name of life. In a past age, thinkers and dreamers and artistic pigs, rejecting the forms they found, had given unconscious shape to this marriage law, which, after they had become the wind, had formed itself out of their exiled pictures and thoughts and dreams. And now this particular law in turn was the dried rind, devoid of pips or speculation, and the thinkers and dreamers and artistic pigs were again rejecting it, and again themselves in exile. This exiled faith, this honour amongst thieves, animated a little conversation between Hilary and Bianca on the Tuesday following the night when Mr. Stone sat on his bed to watch the rising moon. Quietly Bianca said, "I think I should be going away for a time. Wouldn't you rather that I went instead? You are wanted, I am not." That ice-cold, ice-clear remark contained the pith of the whole matter, and Hilary said, "You're not going at once?" "At the end of the week, I think." Noting his eyes fixed on her, she added, "Yes, we're neither of us looking quite our best." "I'm sorry."
I know you are. This had been all. It had been sufficient to bring Hilary once more face to face with the situation. Its constituent elements remained the same. Relative values had much changed. The temptations of St. Anthony were becoming more poignant every hour. He had no principles to pit against them. He had merely the inveterate distaste for hurting anybody, and a feeling that if he yielded to his inclination, he would be faced ultimately with a worse situation than ever. It was not possible for him to look at the position as Mr. Percy might have done if his wife had withdrawn from him and a girl had put herself in his way. Neither hesitation because of the defenceless position of the girl, nor hesitation because of his own future with her, would have troubled Mr. Percy. He, good man, in his straightforward way, would have only thought about the present, not indeed intending to have a future with a young person of that class. Consideration for a wife who had withdrawn from the society of Mr. Percy would also naturally have been absent from the equation. That Hilary worried over all these questions was the mark of his fin de sièclisme, and in the meantime the facts demanded a decision. He had not spoken to this girl since the day of the baby's funeral, but in that long look from the garden he had in effect said, "You are drawing me to the only sort of union possible to us." And she in effect had answered, "Do what you like with me." There were other factors too to be reckoned with. Hughes would be released tomorrow. The little model would not stop her visits unless forced to. Mr. Stone could not well do without her. Bianca had in effect declared that she was being driven out of her own house. It was this situation which Hilary, seated beneath the bust of Socrates, turned over and over in his mind. Long and painful reflection brought him back continually to the thought that he himself, and not Bianca, had better go away. He was extremely bitter and contemptuous towards himself that he had not done so long ago. He made use of the names Martin had given him: Hamlet, amateur, invertebrate. They gave him, unfortunately, little comfort. In the afternoon he received a visit. Mr. Stone came in with his osier fruit bag in his hand. He remained standing and spoke at once. "Is my daughter happy?" At this unexpected question Hilary walked over to the fireplace. "No," he said at last. "I am afraid she is not." "Why?" Hilary was silent. Then, facing the old man, he said, "I think she will be glad, for certain reasons, if I go away for a time." "When are you going?" asked Mr. Stone. "As soon as I can." Mr. Stone's eyes, wistfully bright, seemed trying to see through heavy fog. "She came to me, I think," he said. "I seem to recollect her crying. You were good to her?" "I have tried to be," said Hilary. Mr. Stone's face was discoloured by a flush. "You have no children?" he said painfully. "Do you live together?" Hilary shook his head. "You are estranged?" said Mr. Stone. Hilary bowed. There was a long silence. Mr. Stone's eyes had travelled to the window. "Without love there cannot be life," he said at last, and fixing his wistful gaze on Hilary, asked, "Does she love another?" Again Hilary shook his head. When Mr. Stone next spoke it was clearly to himself. "I do not know why I am glad. Do you love another?" At this question Hilary's eyebrows settled in a frown. "What do you mean by love?" he said. Mr. Stone did not reply. It was evident that he was reflecting deeply. His lips began to move. "By love I mean the forgetfulness of self. Unions are frequent in which only the sexual instincts or the remembrance of self are roused." "That is true," muttered Hilary. Mr. Stone looked up. Painful traces of confusion showed in his face. "We were discussing something." "I was telling you," said Hilary, "that it would be better for your daughter if I go away for a time." "Yes," said Mr. Stone, "you are estranged." Hilary went back to his stand before the empty fireplace.
"There is one thing, sir," he said, "on my conscience to say before I go, and I must leave it to you to decide. The little girl who comes to you no longer lives where she used to live." "In the street," said Mr. Stone. Henry went on quickly. "She was obliged to leave because the husband of the woman with whom she used to lodge became infatuated with her. He has been in prison and comes out tomorrow. If she continues to come here, he will of course be able to find her. I'm afraid he will pursue her again. Have I made it clear to you?" "No," said Mr. Stone. "The man," resumed Henry patiently, "is a poor, violent creature who has been wounded in the head. He is not quite responsible. He may do the girl an injury." "What injury?" "He has stabbed his wife already." "I will speak to him," said Mr. Stone. Henry smiled. "I'm afraid that words will hardly meet the case. She ought to disappear." There was silence. "My book?" said Mr. Stone. It smote Hilary to see how white his face had become. "It's better," he thought, "to bring his willpower into play. She will never come here anyway after I'm gone." But, unable to bear the tragedy in the old man's eyes, he touched him on the arm. "Perhaps she will take the risk, sir, if you ask her." Mr. Stone did not answer, and not knowing what more to say, Hilary went back to the window. Miranda was slumbering lightly out there in the speckled shade, where it was not too warm and not too cold, her cheek resting on her paw and white teeth showing. Mr. Stone's voice rose again. "You're right. I cannot ask her to run a risk like that." "She is just coming up the garden," Henry said huskily. "Shall I tell her to come in?" "Yes," said Mr. Stone. Henry beckoned. The girl came in carrying a tiny bunch of lilies of the valley. Her face fell at sight of Mr. Stone. She stood still, raising the lilies to her breast. Nothing could have been more striking than the change from her look of guttered expectancy to a sort of hard dismay. A spot of red came into both her cheeks. She gazed from Mr. Stone to Hilary and back again. Both were staring at her. No one spoke. The little model's bosom began heaving as though she had been running. She said faintly, "Look, I brought this, Mr. Stone," and held out to him the bunch of lilies. But Mr. Stone made no sign. "Don't you like them?" Mr. Stone's eyes remained fastened on her face. To Hilary this suspense was evidently most distressing. "Come, will you tell her, sir?" he said, "or shall I?" Mr. Stone spoke. "I shall try and write my book without you. You must not run this risk. I cannot allow it." The little model turned her eyes from side to side. "But I like to copy out your book," she said. "The man will injure you," said Mr. Stone. The little model looked at Hilary. "I don't care if he does. I'm not afraid of him. I could look after myself. I'm used to it." "I am going away," said Hilary quietly. After a desperate look that seemed to ask, "Am I going too?" the little model stood as though frozen. Wishing to end the painful scene, Hilary went up to Mr. Stone. "Do you want to dictate to her this afternoon, sir?" "No," said Mr. Stone. "Nor tomorrow?" "Will you come a little walk with me?" Mr. Stone bowed. Hilary turned to the little model. "It is good-bye, then," he said. She did not take his hand. Her eyes, turned sideways, glinted. Her teeth were fastened on her lower lip. She dropped the lilies, suddenly looked up at him, gulped, and slunk away. In passing, she had smeared the lilies with her foot. Hilary picked up the fragments of the flowers and dropped them into the grate. The fragrance of the bruised blossoms remained clinging to the air. "Shall we get ready for our walk?" he said. Mr. Stone moved feebly to the door. Very soon they were walking silently towards the gardens. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 34. Time's Adventure. This same afternoon, Time, wheeling a bicycle and carrying a light valise, was slipping into a back street out of the old square. Putting her burden down at the pavement's edge, she blew a whistle. A hansom cab appeared, and a man in ragged clothes, who seemed to spring out of the pavement, took hold of her valise. His lean, unshaven face was full of wolfish misery. "Get off with you," the cabman said. "Let him do it," murmured Time. The cab runner hoisted up the trunk, then waited motionless beside the cab. Time handed him 2 coppers. He looked at them in silence and went away. "Poor man," she thought. "That's one of the things we've got to do away with." The cab now proceeded in the direction of the park, Time following on her bicycle and trying to stare about her calmly. "This," she thought, "is the end of the old life. I won't be romantic and imagine I'm doing anything special. I must take it all as a matter of course." He thought of Mr. Percy's face. That person! If he could have seen her at this moment turning her back on comfort. "The moment I get there," she mused, "I shall let Mother know. She can come out tomorrow and see for herself. I can't have hysterics about my disappearance and all that. They must get used to the idea that I mean to be in touch with things. I can't be stopped by what anybody thinks." An approaching motor car brought a startled frown across her brow. Was it that person? But though it was not Mr. Percy and his A1 Damia, it was somebody so like him as made no difference. Time uttered a little laugh. In the park a cool light danced and glittered on the trees and water, and the same cool dancing glitter seemed lighting the girl's eyes. The cabman, unseen, took an admiring look at her. "Nice little bit, this," it said. "Grandfather bathes here," thought Time. "Poor darling. I pity everyone that's old." The cab passed on under the shade of trees out into the road. "I wonder if we have only one self in us," thought Time. "I sometimes feel that I have 2. Uncle Henry would understand what I mean. The pavements are beginning to smell horrid already, and it's only June tomorrow. Will Mother feel my going very much? How glorious if one didn't feel." The cab turned into a narrow street of little shops. It must be dreadful to have to serve in a small shop. What millions of people there are in the world! Can anything be of any use? Martin says what matters is to do one's job. But what is one's job? The cab emerged into a broad, quiet square. "But I'm not going to think of anything," thought Time. "That's fatal. Suppose Father stops my allowance. I should have to earn my living as a typist or something of that sort. But he won't when he sees I mean it. Besides, Mother wouldn't let him." The cab entered the Euston Road, and again the cabman's broad face was turned towards Time with an inquiring stare. "What a hateful road," thought Time. "What dull, ugly, common-looking faces all the people seem to have in London, as if they didn't care for anything but just to get through their day somehow. I've only seen 2 really pretty faces." The cab stopped before a small tobacconist's on the south side of the road. "Have I got to live here?" thought Time. Through the open door a narrow passage led to a narrow staircase covered with oilcloth. She raised her bicycle and wheeled it in. A Jewish-looking youth emerging from the shop accosted her. "Your gentleman friend says you are to stay in your rooms, please, until he comes." His warm, red-brown eyes dwelt on her lovingly. "Shall I take your luggage up, miss?" "Thank you, I can manage." "It's the first floor," said the young man. The little rooms which Time entered were stuffy, clean, and neat. Putting her trunk down in her bedroom, which looked out onto a bare yard, she went into the sitting-room and threw the window up. Down below, the cabman and tobacconist were engaged in conversation. Time caught the expression on their faces a sort of leering curiosity. "How disgusting and horrible men are," she thought, moodily staring at the traffic. All seemed so grim, so inextricable and vast, out there in the grey heat and hurry,
as though some monstrous devil were sporting with a monstrous ant-heap. The reek of petrol and of dung rose to her nostrils. It was so terribly big and hopeless. It was so ugly. I shall never do anything, thought Time. Never, never. Why doesn't Martin come? She went into the bedroom and opened her valise. With the scent of lavender that came from it, there sprang up a vision of her white bedroom at home, and the trees of the green garden, and the blackbirds on the grass. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought her back into the sitting room. Martin was standing in the doorway. Time ran towards him, but stopped abruptly. "I've come, you see. What made you choose this place?" "I'm next door but two, and there's a girl here, one of us. She'll show you the ropes." "Is she a lady?" Martin raised his shoulders. "She is what is called a lady," he said, "but she's the right sort all the same. Nothing will stop her." At this proclamation of supreme virtue, the look on Time's face was very queer. Martin took it from her and went out. Left alone in the little room, the two girls did not at first speak. The girl in grey was watching Time, half timidly, as if she could not tell what to make of this young creature who looked so charming and kept shooting such distrustful glances. "I think it's so awfully sweet of you to come," she said at last. "I know what a good time you have at home. Your cousins often told me. Don't you think he's splendid?" To that question Time made no answer. "Isn't this work horrid?" she said, "prying into people's houses?" The grey girl smiled. "It is rather awful sometimes. I've been at it 6 months now. You get used to it. I've had all the worst things said to me by now, I should think." "You see," said the grey girl's faintly smiling lips, "you soon get the feeling of having to go through with it. We all realise it's got to be done, of course. Your cousin's one of the best of us. Nothing seems to put him out. He has such a nice sort of scornful kindness. I'd rather work with him than anyone." She looked past her new associate into that world outside, where the sky seemed all wires and yellow heat dust. She did not notice Time appraising her from head to foot, with a stare hostile and jealous, but pathetic too, as though confessing that the girl was her superior. "I'm sure I can't do that work," she said suddenly. The grey girl smiled. "Oh, I thought that at first." Then with an admiring look, "But I do think it's rather a shame for you. You're so pretty. Perhaps they put you on to tabulation work, though that's awfully dull. We'll ask your cousin." "No, I'll do the whole or nothing." "Well," said the grey girl, "I've got one house left today. Would you like to come and see the sort of thing?" She took a small notebook from a side pocket in her skirt. "I can't get on without a pocket. You must have something that you can't leave behind. I left 4 little bags and 2 dozen handkerchiefs in 5 weeks before I came back to pockets. It's rather a horrid house, I'm afraid." "I shall be all right," said Time shortly. In the shop doorway the young tobacconist was taking the evening air. He greeted them with his polite but constitutionally leering smile. "Good afternoon, Myth," he said. "Nice evening." "He's rather an awful little man," the grey girl said when they had achieved the crossing of the street. "But he's got quite a nice sense of humour." "Ah," said Time. They had turned into a by-street and stopped before a house which had obviously seen better days. Its windows were cracked, its doors unpainted, and down in the basement could be seen a pile of rags, an evil-looking man seated by it, and a blazing fire. Time felt a little gulping sensation. There was a putrid scent as of burning refuse. She looked at her companion. The grey girl was consulting her notebook with a faint smile on her lips. And in Time's heart rose a feeling almost of hatred for this girl, who was so businesslike in the presence of such sights and scents. The door was opened by a young red-faced woman who looked as if she had been asleep. The grey girl screwed up her shining eyes. "Oh, do you mind if we come in a minute?" she said. "It would be so good of you. We're making a report." "There's nothing to report here," the young woman answered. But the grey girl had slipped as gently past as though she had been the very spirit of adventure. "Of course I see that, but Just as a matter of form, you know. I've parted with most of my things, the young woman said defensively, since my husband died. It's an hard life. Yes, but not worse than mine, always poking my nose into other people's houses. The young woman was silent, evidently surprised. The landlord ought to keep you in better repair, said the grey girl. He owns next door too, doesn't he? The young woman nodded. He's a bad landlord. All down the street here it's the same. Can't get nothing done. The grey girl had gone over to a dirty bassinet, where a half-naked child sprawled. An ugly little girl with fat red cheeks was sitting on a stool beside it, close to an open locker, wherein could be seen a number of old meat bones. Your chickabiddies, said the grey girl. Aren't they sweet? The young woman's face became illumined by a smile. They're healthy, she said. That's more than can be said for all the children in the house, I expect, murmured the grey girl. The young woman replied emphatically, as though voicing an old grievance. The three on the first floor's not so bad, but I don't let 'em have anything to do with that lot at the top. Time saw her new friend's hand hover over the child's head like some pale dove. In answer to that gesture, the mother nodded. Just that. You've got to clean 'em every time they go near them children at the top. The grey girl looked at Time. That's where we've got to go, evidently, she seemed to say. A dirty lot, muttered the young woman. It's very hard on you. It is. I'm working at the laundry all day when I can get it. I can't look after the children. They get everywhere. Very hard, murmured the grey girl. I'll make a note of that. Together with the little book in which she was writing furiously, she pulled out her handkerchief, and the sight of this handkerchief reposing on the floor gave Time a queer satisfaction, such as comes when one remarks in superior people the absence of a virtue existing in oneself. Well, we mustn't keep you, Mrs. Cleary. How old's this little one? 4? And the other? 2? They are ducks. Goodbye. In the corridor outside, the grey girl whispered, I do like the way we all pride ourselves on being better than someone else. I think it's so hopeful and jolly. Shall we go up and see the abyss at the top? End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 35. A Young Girl's Mind. A young girl's mind is like a wood in spring. Now a rising mist of bluebells and flakes of dappled sunlight. Now a world of still, wan, and tender saplings, weeping they know not why. Through the curling twigs of boughs just green, its wings fly towards the stars, but the next moment they have drooped to mope beneath the damp bushes. It is ever yearning for and trembling of the future. In its secret places all the countless shapes of things that are to be are taking stealthy counsel of how to grow up without letting their gown of mystery fall. They rustle, whisper, shriek suddenly, and as suddenly fall into a delicious silence. From the first hazel bush to the last may tree, it is an unending meeting place of young, solemn things, eager to find out what they are, eager to rush forth to greet the kisses of the wind and sun, and forever trembling back and hiding their faces. The spirit of that wood seems to lie with her ear close to the ground, a pale petal of a hand curved like a shell behind it, listening for the whisper of her own life. There she lies, white and supple, with dewy, wistful eyes, sighing, What is my meaning? Ah, I am everything. Is there in all the world a thing so wonderful as I? Oh, I am nothing. My wings are heavy. I faint. I die. When Time, attended by the grey girl, emerged from the abyss at the top, her cheeks were flushed and her hands clenched. She said nothing. The grey girl, too, was silent, with a look such as a spirit divested of its body by long bathing in the river of reality might bend on one who has just come to dip her head. Time's quick eyes saw that look, and her colour deepened. She saw, too, the glance of the Jewish youth when Martin joined them in the doorway.
2 girls now, he seemed to say. He goes it, this young man. Supper was laid in her new friend's room. Pressed beef, potato salad, stewed prunes, and ginger ale. Martin and the grey girl talked. Time ate in silence, but though her eyes seemed fastened on her plate, she saw every glance that passed between them, heard every word they said. Those glances were not remarkable, nor were those words particularly important, but they were spoken in tones that seemed important to Time. He never talks to me like that, she thought. When supper was over, they went out into the streets to walk. But at the door the grey girl gave Time's arm a squeeze, her cheek a swift kiss, and turned back up the stairs. "Aren't you coming?" shouted Martin. Her voice was heard answering from above. "No, not tonight." With the back of her hand, Time rubbed off the kiss. The 2 cousins walked out amongst the traffic. The evening was very warm and close. No breeze fanned the reeking town. Speaking little, they wandered among endless darkening streets, whence to return to the light and traffic over the Euston Road seemed like coming back to heaven. At last, close again to her new home, Time said, "Why should one bother? It's all a horrible great machine trying to blot us out. People are like insects when you put your thumb on them and smear them on a book. I loathe it." "They might as well be healthy insects while they last," answered Martin. Time faced round at him. "I shan't sleep tonight, Martin. Get out my bicycle for me." Martin scrutinised her by the light of the street lamp. "All right," he said. "I'll come too." There are, say moralists, roads that lead to hell, but it was on a road that leads to Hampstead that the 2 young cyclists set forth towards 11 o'clock. The difference between the character of the 2 destinations was soon apparent, for whereas man taken in bulk had perhaps made hell, Hampstead had obviously been made by the upper classes. There were trees and gardens, and instead of dark canals of sky banked by the roofs of houses and hazed with the yellow scum of London lights, the heavens spread out in a wide trembling pool. From that rampart of the town, the Spaniards' Road, 2 plains lay exposed to left and right. The scent of May-tree blossom had stolen up the hill. The rising moon clung to a fir-tree bough. Over the country the far stars presided, and sleep's dark wings were spread above the fields. Silent, scarce breathing, lay the body of the land. But to the south, where the town, that restless head, was lying, the stars seemed to have fallen and were sown in the 1,000 furrows of its great grey marsh. And from the dark miasma of those streets there travelled up a rustle, a whisper, the far allurement of some deathless dancer, dragging men to watch the swirl of her black spangled drapery, the gleam of her writhing limbs. Like the son of the sea in a shell was the murmur of that witch of motion, clasping to her the souls of men, drawing them down into a soul whom none had ever known to rest. Above the 2 young cousins, scudding along that ridge between the country and the town, 3 thin white clouds trailed slowly towards the west, like tired sea-birds drifting exhausted far out from land on a sea blue to blackness with unfathomable depth. For an hour those 2 rode silently into the country. "Have we come far enough?" Martin said at last. Time shook her head. A long steep hill beyond a little sleeping village had brought them to a standstill. Across the shadowy fields a pale sheet of water gleamed out in moonlight. Time turned down towards it. "I'm hot," she said. "I want to bathe my face. Stay here, don't come with me." She left her bicycle, and, passing through a gate, vanished among the trees. Martin stayed leaning against the gate. The village clock struck 1. The distant call of a hunting owl, "Queek, queek," sounded through the grave stillness of this last night of May. The moon at her curved summit floated at peace on the blue surface of the sky, a great closed water lily. And Martin saw through the trees scimitar-shaped reeds clustering black along the pool's shore. All about him the May flowers were alight. It was such a night as makes dreams real and turns reality to dreams. All moonlit nonsense, thought the young man, for the night disturbed his heart. But time did not come back. He called to her, and in the death-like silence following his shouts he could hear his own heart beat. He passed in through the gate. She was nowhere to be seen. Why was she playing him this trick? He turned up from the water among the trees where the incense of the mayflowers hung heavy in the air. Never look for a thing, he thought, and stopped to listen. It was so breathless that the leaves of a low bough against his cheek did not stir while he stood there. Presently he heard faint sounds and stole towards them. Under a beech tree he almost stumbled over Time, lying with her face pressed to the ground. The young doctor's heart gave a sickening leap. He quickly knelt down beside her. The girl's body, pressed close to the dry beech mat, was being shaken by long sobs. From head to foot it quivered. Her hat had been torn off, and the fragrance of her hair mingled with the fragrance of the night. In Martin's heart something seemed to turn over and over, as, when a boy, he had watched a rabbit caught in a snare. He touched her. She sat up, and, dashing her hand across her eyes, cried, "Go away! Oh, go away!" He put his arm round her and waited. 5 minutes passed. The air was trembling with a sort of pale vibration, for the moonlight had found a hole in the dark foliage and flooded onto the ground beside them, whitening the black beech husks. Some tiny bird, disturbed by these unwanted visitors, began chirruping and fluttering, but was soon still again. To Martin, so strangely close to this young creature in the night, there came a sense of utter disturbance. Poor little thing, he thought. Be careful of her. Comfort her. Hardness seemed so broken out of her, and the night so wonderful. And there came into the young man's heart a throb of the knowledge, very rare with him, for he was not, like Hilary, a philosophizing person, that she was as real as himself, suffering, hoping, feeling, not his hopes and feelings, but her own. His fingers kept pressing her shoulder through her thin blouse, and the touch of those fingers was worth more than any words, as this night, all moonlit dreams, was worth more than 1,000 nights of sane reality. Time twisted herself away from him at last. "I can't," she sobbed. "I'm not what you thought me. I'm not made for it." A scornful little smile curled Martin's lip. So that was it. But the smile soon died away. One did not hit what was already down. Time's voice wailed through the silence. I thought I could, but I want beautiful things. I can't bear it all grey and horrible. I'm not like that girl. I'm an amateur." If I kissed her, Martin thought. She sank down again, burying her face in the dark beech mat. The moonlight had passed on. Her voice came, faint and stiff, as out of the tomb of faith. "I'm no good. I never shall be. I'm as bad as mother." But to Martin there was only the scent of her hair. "No," murmured Time's voice. "I'm only fit for miserable art. I'm only fit for nothing." They were so close together on the dark beech mat that their bodies touched, and a longing to clasp her in his arms came over him. "I'm a selfish beast," moaned the smothered voice. "I don't really care for all these people. I only care because they're ugly for me to see." Martin reached his hand out to her hair. If she had shrunk away he would have seized her, but as though by instinct she let it rest there. And at her sudden stillness, strange and touching, Martin's quick passion left him. He slipped his arm round her and raised her up as if she had been a child, and for a long time sat listening with a queer, twisted smile to the moanings of her lost illusions. The dawn found them still sitting there against the bole of the beech tree. Her lips were parted. The tears had dried on her sleeping face, pillowed against his shoulder, while he still watched her sideways with the ghost of that twisted smile. And beyond the grey water, like some tired wanton, the moon in an orange hood was stealing down to her rest between the trees. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evans. Chapter 36. Stephen signs cheques. Cecilia received the mystic document containing these words: "Am quite all right. Address 598 Euston Road, 3 doors off Martin. Letter follows explaining. Time." She had not even realized her little daughter's departure. She went up to Time's room at once, and opening all the drawers and cupboards, stared into them one by one. The many things she saw there allayed the first pangs of her disquiet. She's only taken one little trunk, she thought, and left all her evening frocks. This act of independence alarmed rather than surprised her. Such had been her sense of the unrest in the domestic atmosphere during the last month. Since the evening when she had found Time in floods of tears because of the Hughes baby, her maternal eyes had not failed to notice something new in the child's demeanour, a moodiness, an air almost of conspiracy, together with an emphatic increase of youthful sarcasm. Fearful of probing deep, she had sought no confidence, nor had she divulged her doubts to Stephen. Amongst the blouses, a sheet of blue ruled paper which had evidently escaped from a notebook caught her eye. Sentences were scrawled on it in pencil. Cecilia read: "That poor little dead thing was so grey and pinched, and I seem to realise all of a sudden how awful it is for them. I will do something." Cecilia dropped the sheet of paper. Her hand was trembling. There was no mystery in that departure now, and Stephen's words came into her mind. "It's all very well up to a certain point, and nobody sympathises with them more than I do, but after that it becomes destructive of all comfort, and that does no good to anyone." The sound sense of those words had made her feel queer when they were spoken. They were even more sensible than she had thought. Did her little daughter, so young and pretty, seriously mean to plunge into the rescue work of dismal slums, to cut herself adrift from sweet sounds and scents and colours, from music and art, from dancing, flowers, and all that made life beautiful? The secret forces of fastidiousness, an inborn dread of the fanatical, and all her real ignorance of what such a life was like, rose to Cecilia with a force which made her feel quite sick. Better that she herself should do this thing than that her own child should be deprived of air and light and all the just environment of her youth and beauty. She must come back. She must listen to me, she thought. We will begin together. We will start a nice little crèche of our own, or perhaps Mrs. Tallant's small piece could find us some regular work on one of her committees. Then suddenly she conceived a thought which made her blood run positively cold. What if it were a matter of heredity? What if Time had inherited her grandfather's single-mindedness? Martin was giving proof of it. Things she knew often skipped a generation and then set in again. Surely it could not have done that. With longing, yet with dread, she waited for the sound of Stephen's latchkey. It came at its appointed time. Even in her agitation, Cecilia did not forget to spare him all she could. She began by giving him a kiss, and then said casually, "Time has got a whim into her head." "What whim?" "It's rather what you might expect," faltered Cecilia, "from her going about so much with Martin." Stephen's face assumed at once an air of dry derision. There was no love lost between him and his young nephew-in-law. "The sanitist," he said. "Ah, well?" "She's gone off to do work some place in the Euston Road. I've had a telegram. Oh, and I found this, Stephen." She held out to him half-heartedly the 2 bits of paper, one pinkish-brown, the other blue. Stephen saw that she was trembling. He took them from her, read them, and looked at her again.
He had a real affection for his wife, and the tradition of consideration for other people's feelings was bred in him, so that at this moment, so vitally disturbing, the first thing he did was to put his hand on her shoulder and give it a reassuring squeeze. But there was also in Stephen a certain primitive virility, pickled, it is true, at Cambridge and in the law courts dried, but still preserving something of its possessive and assertive quality. And the second thing he did was to say, "Now I'm damned." In that little sentence lay the whole psychology of his attitude towards his situation, and all the difference between two classes of the population. Mr. Percy would undoubtedly have said, "Well, I'm damned." Stephen, by saying, "No, I'm damned," betrayed that before he could be damned he had been obliged to wrestle and contend with something. And Cecilia, who was always wrestling too, knew this something to be that queer new thing, a social conscience, the dim bogey stalking pale about the house of those who, through the accidents of leisure or of culture, have once left the door open to the suspicion, is it possible that there is a class of people besides my own, or am I dreaming? Happy the millions, poor or rich, not yet condemned to watch the wistful visiting or hear the husky mutter of that ghost, happy in their homes, blessed by a less disquieting God. Such were Cecilia's inner feelings. Even now she did not quite plumb the depths of Stephen's. She felt his struggle with the ghost. She felt and admired his victory. What she did not, could not, perhaps, realize was the precise nature of the outrage inflicted on him by time's action. With her, being a woman, the matter was more practical. She did not grasp, had never grasped, the architectural nature of Stephen's mind, how really hurt he was by what did not seem to him in due and proper order. He spoke. Why on earth, if she felt like that, couldn't she have gone to work in the ordinary way? She could have put herself in connection with some proper charitable society. I should never have objected to that. It's all that young sanitary idiot. I believe, Cecilia faltered, that Martin's is a society. It's a kind of medical socialism or something of that sort. He has tremendous faith in it. Stephen's lip curled. He may have as much faith as he likes, he said, with a restraint that was one of his best qualities, so long as he doesn't infect my daughter with it. Cecilia said suddenly, What are we to do, Stephen? Shall I go over there tonight? As one may see a shadow pass down on a cornfield, so came the cloud on Stephen's face. It was as though he had not realized till then the full extent of what this meant. For a minute he was silent. Better wait for her letter, he said at last. He's her cousin, after all, and Mrs. Grundy's dead. In the Euston Road, at all events. So, trying to spare each other all they could of anxiety, and careful to abstain from any hint of trouble before the servants, they dined and went to bed. At that hour between the night and morning, when man's vitality is lowest, and the tremors of his spirit, like birds of ill omen, fly round and round him, beating their long plumes against his cheeks, Stephen woke. It was very still. A bar of pearly grey dawn showed between the filmy curtains, which stirred with a regular, faint movement, like the puffing of a sleeper's lips. The tide of the wind, woven in Mr. Stone's fancy of the souls of men, was at low ebb. Feebly it fanned the houses and hovels where the myriad forms of men lay sleeping, unconscious of its breath. So faint life's pulse, that men and shadows seemed for that brief moment mingled in the town's sleep. Over the million varied roofs, over the 100 million little different shapes of men and things, the wind's quiet visiting wand had stilled all into the wonder state of nothingness, when life is passing into death, death into new life, and self is at its feeblest. And Stephen's self, feeling the magnetic currents of that ebb tide drawing it down into murmurous slumber, out beyond the sandbars of individuality and class, threw up its little hands and began to cry for help. The purple sea of self-forgetfulness under the dim, impersonal sky seemed to him so cold and terrible. It had no limit that he could see, no rules but such as hung too far away, written in the hieroglyphics of paling stars. He could feel no order in the lift and lap of the wan waters round his limbs. Where would those waters carry him? To what depth of still green silence? Was his own little daughter to go down into this sea that knew no creed but that of self-forgetfulness, that respected neither class nor person? This sea where a few wandering streaks seemed all the evidence of the precious differences between mankind? God forbid it! And turning on his elbow, he looked at her who had given him this daughter. In the mystery of his wife's sleeping face, the face of her most near and dear to him, he tried hard not to see a likeness to Mr. Stone. He fell back, somewhat comforted with the thought. That old chap has his one idea, his universal brotherhood. He's absolutely absorbed in it. I don't see it in Sissy's face a bit. Quite the contrary. But suddenly, a flash of clear, hard cynicism amounting to inspiration utterly disturbed him. The old chap indeed was so wrapped up in himself and his precious book as to be quite unconscious that anyone else was alive. Could one be everybody's brother if one were blind to their existence? But this freak of times was an actual try to be everybody's sister. For that, he supposed, one must forget oneself. Why, it was really even a worse case than that of Mr. Stone. And to Stephen there was something awful in this thought. The first small bird of morning, close to the open window, uttered a feeble chirp. Into Stephen's mind there leaped without reason recollection of the morning after his first term at school, when, awakened by the birds, he had started up and fished out from under his pillow his catapult and the box of shot he had brought home and taken to sleep with him. He seemed to see again those leaden shot with their bluish sheen, and to feel them round and soft and heavy rolling about his palm. He seemed to hear Hilary's surprised voice saying, "Hello, Stevie, you awake?" No one had ever had a better brother than old Hilary. His only fault was that he had always been too kind. It was his kindness that had done for him and made his married life a failure. He had never asserted himself enough with that woman, his wife. Stephen turned over on his other side. All this confounded business, he thought, comes from over-sympathizing. That's what the matter with time, too. Long he lay thus, while the light grew stronger, listening to Cecilia's gentle breathing, disturbed to his very marrow by these thoughts. The first post brought no letter from Time, and the announcement soon after that Mr. Harari had come to breakfast was received by both Stephen and Cecilia with a welcome such as the anxious give to anything which shows promise of distracting them. Stephen made haste down. Hilary, with a very grave and harassed face, was in the dining-room. It was he, however, who, after one look at Stephen, said, "What's the matter, Stevie?" Stephen took up the Standard. In spite of his self-control, his hand shook a little. "That's a ridiculous business," he said. "That precious young Sanitas has so worked his confounded theories into Time that she has gone off to the Euston Road to put them into practice, of all things." At the half-concerned amusement on Hilary's face, his quick and rather narrow eyes glinted. "It's not exactly for you to laugh, Hilary," he said. "It's all of a piece with your cursed sentimentality about those Hughes and that girl. I knew it would end in a mess." Hilary answered this unjust and unexpected outburst by a look, and Stephen, with the strange feeling of inferiority which would come to him in Hilary's presence, against his better judgment, lowered his own glance. "My dear boy," said Hilary, "if any bit of my character has crept into Time, I'm truly sorry." Stephen took his brother's hand and gave it a good grip, and Cecilia coming in, they all sat down. Cecilia at once noticed what Hilary, in his preoccupation, had not, that Hilary had come to tell them something. But she did not like to ask him what it was, then she knew that in the presence of their trouble Hilary was too delicate to obtrude his own. She did not like either to talk of her trouble in the presence of his. They all talked, therefore, of indifferent things, what music they had heard, what plays they had seen, eating but little and drinking tea. In the middle of a remark about the opera, Stephen, looking up, saw Martin himself standing in the doorway. The young sanitist looked pale, dusty, and dishevelled. He advanced towards Cecilia, and said with his usual cool determination, "I've brought her back, Aunt Cis." At that moment, fraught with such relief, such pure joy, such desire to say 1,000 things, Cecilia could only murmur, "Oh, Martin." Stephen, who had jumped up, asked, "Where is she?" "Gone to her room." "Then perhaps," said Stephen, regaining at once his dry composure, "you will give us some explanation of this folly." "She's no use to us at present." "Indeed?" "None." "Then," said Stephen, "kindly understand we have no use for you in future, or any of your sort." Martin looked round the table, resting his eyes on each in turn. "You're right," he said. "Goodbye." Hilary and Cecilia had risen too. There was silence. Stephen crossed to the door. "You seem to me," he said suddenly in his driest voice, "with your new manners and ideas, quite a pernicious youth." Cecilia stretched her hands out towards Martin, and there was a faint tinkling as of chains. "You must know, dear," she said, "how anxious we've all been. Of course, your uncle doesn't mean that." The same scornful tenderness with which he was wont to look at time passed into Martin's face. "All right, Aunt Cis," he said. "If Stephen doesn't mean it, he ought to. To mean things is what matters." He stooped and kissed her forehead. "Give that to time for me," he said. "I shan't see her for a bit." "You'll never see her, sir," said Stephen dryly, "if I can help it. The liquor of your sanitism is too bright an effervescence." Martin's smile broadened. "For old bottles," he said, and with another slow look round went out. Stephen's mouth assumed its driest twist. "Bumptious young devil," he said. "If that is the new young man, defend us." Over the cool dining room, with its faint scent of pinks, of melon, and of ham, came silence. Suddenly Cecilia glided from the room. Her light footsteps were heard hurrying, now that she was not visible, up to time. Hilary too had moved towards the door. In spite of his preoccupation, Stephen could not help noticing how very worn his brother looked. "You look quite seedy, old boy," he said. "Will you have some brandy?" Hilary shook his head. "Now that you've got time back," he said, "I'd better let you know my news. I'm going abroad tomorrow. I don't know whether I shall come back again to live with B." Stephen gave a low whistle. Then, pressing Hilary's arm, he said, "Anything you decide, old man. I'll always back you in, but I'm going alone." In his relief, Stephen violated the laws of reticence. "Thank heaven for that. I was afraid you were beginning to lose your head about that girl." "I'm not quite fool enough," said Hilary, "to imagine that such a liaison will be anything but misery in the long run. If I took the child, I should have to stick to her. But I'm not proud of leaving her in the lurch, Stevie." The tone of his voice was so bitter that Stephen seized his hand. "My dear old man, you're too kind. Why, she's no hold on you, not the smallest in the world." "Except the hold of this devotion I've aroused in her, God knows how, and her destitution." "You let these people haunt you," said Stephen. It's quite a mistake, it really is." "I've forgotten to mention that I'm not an iceberg," muttered Hilary. Stephen looked into his face without speaking. Then, with the utmost earnestness, he said, "However much you may be attracted, it's simply unthinkable for a man like you to go outside his class." "Class, yes," muttered Hilary. "Good-bye." And with a long grip of his brother's hand, he went away. Stephen turned to the window. For all the care and contrivance bestowed on the view, far away to the left the back courts of an alley could be seen, and as though some gadfly had planted in him its small poisonous sting, he moved back from the sight at once. "Confusion," he thought. "Are we never to get rid of these infernal people?" His eyes lighted on the melon. A single slice lay by itself on a blue-green dish. Leaning over a plate with a desperation quite unlike himself, he took an enormous bite. Again and again he bit the slice, then almost threw it from him and dipped his fingers in a bowl. Thank God, he thought, that's over. What an escape! Whether he meant Hilary's escape or Time's was doubtful, but there came on him a longing to rush up to his little daughter's room and hug her. He suppressed it and sat down at the bureau. He was suddenly experiencing a sensation such as he had sometimes felt on a perfect day, or after physical danger, of too much benefit, of something that he would like to return thanks for, yet knew not how. His hand stole to the inner pocket of his black coat. It stole out again. There was a cheque-book in it. Before his mind's eye, starting up one after the other, he saw the names of the societies he supported, or meant sometime, if he could afford it, to support. He reached his hand out for a pen. The still, small noise of the nib travelling across the cheques mingled with the buzzing of a single fly. These sounds Cecilia heard when, from the open door, she saw the thin back of her husband's neck, with its softly graduated hair, bent forward above the bureau. She stole over to him and pressed herself against his arm. Stephen, staying the progress of his pen, looked up at her. Their eyes met, and bending down, Cecilia put her cheek to his. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 37. The Flowering of the Aloe. This same day, returning through Kensington Gardens from his preparations for departure, Hilary came suddenly on Bianca, standing by the shores of the Round Pond. To the eyes of the frequenters of these Elysian fields, where so many men and shadows daily steal recreation, to the eyes of all drinking in those green gardens their honeyed draught of peace, this husband and wife appeared merely a distinguished-looking couple, animated by a leisured harmony. For the time was not yet when men were one, and could tell by instinct what was passing in each other's hearts. In truth, there were not too many people in London who in their situation would have behaved with such seemliness, not too many so civilized as they. Estranged, and soon to part, they retained the manner of accord up to the last. Not for them the matrimonial brawl, the solemn accusation and recrimination, the pathetic protestations of proprietary rights. For them no sacred view that at all costs they must make each other miserable, not even the belief that they had the right to do so. No, there was no relief for their sore hearts. They walked side by side, treating each other's feelings with respect, as if there had been no terrible heart-turnings throughout the 18 years in which they had first loved, then, through mysterious disharmony, drifted apart, as if there were now between them no question of this girl. Presently Hilary said, "I've been into town and made my preparations. I'm starting tomorrow for the mountains. There will be no necessity for you to leave your father." "Are you taking her?" It was beautifully uttered, without a trace of bias or curiosity, with an unforced accent, neither indifferent nor too interested. No one could have told whether it was meant for generosity or malice. Hilary took it for the former. "Thank you," he said, "but that comedy is finished." Close to the edge of the Round Pond, a swan-like cutter was putting out to sea. In the wake of this fair creature, a tiny scooped-out bit of wood, with 3 feathers for masts, bobbed and trembled, and the 2 small ragged boys who owned that little galley were stretching bits of branch out towards her over the bright waters. Bianca looked, without seeing, at this proof of man's pride in his own property. A thin gold chain hung round her neck. Suddenly she thrust it into the bosom of her dress. It had broken into 2 between her fingers. They reached home without another word. At the door of Hilary's study sat Miranda.
The little person answered his caress by a shiver of her sleek skin, then curled herself down again on the spot she had already warmed. "Aren't you coming in with me?" he said. Miranda did not move. The reason for her refusal was apparent when Hilary had entered. Close to the long bookcase, behind the bust of Socrates, stood the little model. Very still, as if fearing to betray itself by sound or movement, was her figure in its blue-green frock, and a brimless toque of brown straw, with 2 purplish roses squashed together into a band of darker velvet. Beside those roses a tiny peacock's feather had been slipped in. Unholy little visitor, slanting backward, trying, as it were, to draw all eyes, yet to escape notice. And, wedged between the grim white bust and the dark bookcase, the girl herself was like some unlawful spirit which had slid in there, and stood trembling and vibrating, ready to be shuttered out. Before this apparition Hilary recoiled towards the door, hesitated, and returned. "You should not have come here," he muttered, "after what we said to you yesterday." The little model answered quickly, "But I've seen Mr. Hughes, Mr. Dallison. He's found out where I live. Oh, he does look dreadful. He frightens me. I can't ever stay there now." She had come a little out of her hiding place and stood fidgeting her hands and looking down. "She's not speaking the truth," thought Hilary. The little model gave him a furtive glance. "I did see him," she said. "I must go right away now. It wouldn't be safe, would it?" Again she gave him that swift look. Hilary thought suddenly, "She's using my own weapon against me. If she has seen the man, he didn't frighten her. It serves me right." With a dry laugh he turned his back. There was a rustling round. The little model had moved out of her retreat and stood between him and the door. At this stealthy action Hilary felt once more the tremor which had come over him when he sat beside her on the broad walk after the baby's funeral. Outside in the garden a pigeon was pouring forth a continuous love song. Hilary heard nothing of it, conscious only of the figure of the girl behind him, that young figure which had twined itself about his senses. "Well, what is it you want?" he said at last. The little model answered by another question. "Are you really going away, Mr. Dallison?" "I am." She raised her hands to the level of her breast, as though she meant to clasp them together. Without doing so, however, she dropped them to her sides. They were cased in very worn suede gloves, and in this dire moment of embarrassment Hilary's eyes fastened themselves on those slim hands moving against her skirt. The little model tried at once to slip them away behind her. Suddenly she said in her matter-of-fact voice, "I only wanted to ask, can't I come too?" At this question, whose simplicity might have made an angel smile, Hilary experienced a sensation as if his bones had been turned to water. It was strange, delicious, as though he had been suddenly offered all that he wanted of her, without all those things that he did not want. He stood regarding her silently. Her cheeks and neck were red. There was a red tinge, too, in her eyelids, deepening the chicory flower colour of her eyes. She began to speak, repeating a lesson evidently learned by heart. "I wouldn't be in your way. I wouldn't cost much. I could do everything you wanted. I could learn typewriting. I needn't live too near all that. If you didn't want me because of people talking, I'm used to being alone. Oh, Mr. Dallison, I could do everything for you. I wouldn't mind anything, and I'm not like some girls. I do know what I'm talking about." "Do you?" The little model put her hands up and, covering her face, said, "If you try and see." Hilary's sensuous feeling almost vanished. A lump rose in his throat instead. "My child," he said, "you are too generous." The little model seemed to know instinctively that by touching his spirit she had lost ground. Uncovering her face, she spoke breathlessly, growing very pale. "Oh, no, I'm not. I want to be let come. I don't want to stay here. I know I'll get into mischief if you don't take me. Oh, I know I will." "If I were to let you come with me," said Hilary, "what then? What sort of companion should I be to you, or you to me?" You know very well. Only one sort. It's no use pretending, child, that we've any interests in common. The little model came closer. I know what I am, she said, and I don't want to be anything else. I can do what you tell me to, and I shan't ever complain. I'm not worth any more. You're worth more, muttered Hilary, than I can ever give you, and I'm worth more than you can ever give me. The little model tried to answer, but her words would not pass her throat. She threw her head back, trying to free them, and stood, swaying. Seeing her like this before him, white as a sheet, with her eyes closed and her lips parted, as though about to faint, Hilary seized her by the shoulders. At the touch of those soft shoulders, his face became suffused with blood, his lips trembled. Suddenly her eyes opened ever so little between their lids and looked at him, and the perception that she was not really going to faint, that it was a little desperate wile of this child Delilah, made him wrench away his hands. The moment she felt that grasp relax, she sank down and clasped his knees, pressing them to her bosom so that he could not stir. Closer and closer she pressed them to her, till it seemed as though she must be bruising her flesh. Her breath came in sobs, her eyes were closed, her lips quivered upwards. In the clutch of her clinging body there seemed suddenly the whole of woman's power of self-abandonment. It was just that which at this moment, so horribly painful to him, prevented Hilary from seizing her in his arms, just that queer-seeming self-effacement, as though she were lost to knowledge of what she did. It seemed too brutal, too like taking advantage of a child. From calm is born the wind, the ripple from the still pool, self out of nothingness. So all passes imperceptibly, no man knows how. The little model's moment of self-oblivion passed, and into her wet eyes her plain, twisting spirit suddenly writhed up again, for all the world as if she had said, "I won't let you go. I'll keep you. I'll keep you." Hilary broke away from her, and she fell forward on her face. "Get up, child," he said. "Get up, for God's sake, don't lie there." She rose obediently, choking down her sobs, mopping her face with a small, dirty handkerchief. Suddenly, taking a step towards him, she clenched both her hands and struck them downwards. "I'll go to the bad," she said. "I will, if you don't take me." And her breast heaving, her hair all loose, she stared straight into his face with her red-rimmed eyes. Hilary turned suddenly, took a book up from the writing-table, and opened it. His face was again suffused with blood, his hands and lips trembled, his eyes had a queer fixed stare. "Not now, not now," he muttered. "Go away now. I'll come to you tomorrow." The little model gave him the look a dog gives you when it asks if you are deceiving him. She made a sign on her breast, as a Catholic might make the sign of his religion, drawing her fingers together and clutching at herself with them, then passed her little dirty handkerchief once more over her eyes, and turning round, went out. Hilary remained standing where he was, reading the open book without apprehending what it was. There was a wistful sound as of breath escaping hurriedly. Mr. Stone was standing in the open doorway. "She has been here," he said. "I saw her go away." Hilary dropped the book. His nerves were utterly unstrung. Then, pointing to a chair, he said, "Won't you sit down, sir?" Mr. Stone came close up to his son-in-law. "Is she in trouble?" "Yes," murmured Hilary. "She is too young to be in trouble. Did you tell her that?" Hilary shook his head. "Has the man hurt her?" Again Hilary shook his head. "What is her trouble, then?" said Mr. Stone. The closeness of this catechism, the intent stare of the old man's eyes, were more than Hilary could bear. He turned away. "You ask me something that I cannot answer." "Why?" "It is a private matter." With the blood still beating in his temples, his lips still quivering, and the feeling of the girl's clasp round his knees, he almost hated this old man who stood there putting such blind questions. Then suddenly in Mr. Stone's eyes he saw a startling change, as in the face of a man who regains consciousness after days of vacancy. His whole countenance had become alive with a sort of jealous understanding. The warmth which the little model brought to his old spirit had licked up the fog of his idea and made him see what was going on before his eyes. At that look, Hilary braced himself against the wall. A flush spread slowly over Mr. Stone's face. He spoke with rare hesitation. In this sudden coming back to the world of men and things he seemed astray. I'm not going, he stammered, to ask you any more. I could not pry into a private matter. That would not be... His voice failed. He looked down. Hilary bowed, touched to the quick by the return to life of this old man, so long lost to facts, and by the delicacy in that old face. I will not intrude further on your trouble, said Mr. Stone, whatever it may be. I'm sorry that you are unhappy too. Very slowly, and without again looking up at his son-in-law, he went out. Hilary remained standing where he had been left against the wall. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. The Homecoming of Hughes. Hilary had evidently been right in thinking the little model was not speaking the truth when she said she had seen Hughes, for it was not until early on the following morning that 3 persons traversed the long winding road leading from Wormwood Scrubs to Kensington. They preserved silence, not because there was nothing in their hearts to be expressed, but because there was too much, and they walked in the giraffe-like formation peculiar to the lower classes. Hughes in front, Mrs. Hughes to the left, a foot or two behind, and a yard behind her, to the left again, her son Stanley. They made no sign of noticing anyone in the road besides themselves, and no one in the road gave sign of noticing that they were there. But in their 3 minds, so differently fashioned, a verb was dumbly, and with varying emotion, being conjugated. I've been in prison, you've been in prison, he's been in prison. Beneath the seeming acquiescence of a man subject to domination from his birth up, those 4 words covered in Hughes such a whirlpool of surging sensation, such ferocity of bitterness and madness and defiance, that no outpouring could have appreciably relieved its course. The same 4 words summed up in Mrs. Hughes so strange a mingling of fear, commiseration, loyalty, shame, and trembling curiosity at the new factor which had come into life of all this little family walking giraffe-like back to Kensington, that to have gone beyond them would have been like plunging into a wintry river. To their son, the 4 words were as a legend of romance, conjuring up no definite image, lighting merely the glow of wonder. Don't lag, Stanley. Keep up with your father. The little boy took 3 steps at an increased pace, then fell behind again. His black eyes seemed to answer, You say that because you don't know what else to say. Without alteration in their giraffe-like formation, but again in silence, the 3 proceeded. In the heart of the sempstress, doubt and fear were being slowly knit into dread of the first sound to pass her husband's lips. What would he ask? How should she answer? Would he talk wild, or would he talk sensible? Would he have forgotten that young girl, or had he nursed and nourished his wicked fancy in the house of grief and silence? Would he ask where the baby was? Would he speak a kind word to her? But alongside her dread there was, guttering within her, the undying resolution not to let him go from her, as if it were ever so, to that young girl. Don't lag, Stanley. At the reiteration of these words, Hughes spoke. Let the boy alone. You'll be nagging at the baby next. Hoarse and grating, like sounds issuing from a damp vault, was this first speech. The sempstress's eyes brimmed over. I won't get the chance, she stammered out. He's gone. Hugh's teeth gleamed like those of a dog at bay. Who's taken him? You let me know the name. Tears rolled down the sempstress's cheeks. She could not answer. The little son's thin voice rose instead. "Baby's dead. We buried him in the ground. I saw it. Mr. Creed came in the cab with me." White flecks appeared suddenly at the corner of Hughes's lips. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, and once more, giraffe-like, the little family marched on. Westminster, in his threadbare summer jacket, for the day was warm, had been standing for some little time in Mrs. Budgeon's doorway on the ground floor at Hound Street. Knowing that Hughes was to be released that morning early, he had, with the circumspection and foresight of his character, reasoned thus: "I shan't lie easy in my bed. I shan't have no peace until I know that low fellow's not going to misdemean himself with me. It's no good to go putting of it off. I don't want him coming to my room attacking of old men. I'll be previous with him in the passage. The lame woman'll let me. I shan't trouble her. She'll be valuable between me and him, in case he goes for to attack me. I ain't afraid of him." But as the minutes of waiting went by, his old tongue, like that of a dog expecting chastisement, appeared ever more frequently to moisten his twisted, discoloured lips. "This comes of mixing up with soldiers," he thought, "and a low class man of that. Ought to have changed me lodgings. He'll be asking me where that young girl is, I shouldn't wonder, and him lost his character and his job and everything, and all because of women." He watched the broad-faced woman, Mrs. Budgeon, in whose grey eyes the fighting light so fortunately never died, painfully doing out her rooms, and propping herself against the chest of drawers whereon clustered china cups and dogs as thick as toadstools on a bank. "I've told my Charlie," she said, "to keep clear of yous a bit. They comes out as prickly as hedgehogs. Pick a quarrel as soon as look at you, they will." "Oh dear," thought Creed, "she's full of cold comfort." But careful of his dignity, he answered, "I'm awaiting here to engage the situation. You don't think he'll attack me with definition at this time in the morning?" The lame woman shrugged her shoulders. "He'll have had a drop of something," she said, "before he comes home. They gets a cold feeling in the stomach in them places, poor creatures." The old butler's heart quavered up into his mouth. He lifted his shaking hand and put it to his lips as though to readjust himself. "Oh yes," he said, "ought to have given notice and took my things away. But there, poor woman, seems a hitting of her when she was down, and I don't want to make no move. I ain't got no one else that's interested in me. This woman's very good about many of my clothes. Oh dear, yes, she don't grudge a little thing like that." The lame woman hobbled from her post of rest and began to make the bed with the frown that always accompanied a task which strained the contracted muscles of her leg. "If you don't help your neighbour don't help you," she said sententiously. Creed fixed his iron-rimmed gaze on her in silence. He was considering perhaps how he stood with regard to Hughes in the light of that remark. "I attended of his baby's funeral," he said. "Oh dear, he's here already." The family of Hughes indeed stood in the doorway. The spiritual process by which Westminster had gone through life was displayed completely in the next few seconds. "It's so important for me to keep alive and well," his eyes seemed saying. "I know the class of man you are, but now you're here, it's not a bit of use my being frightened. I'm bound to get upside with you. Ha, yes. Keep yourself to yourself, and don't you let me hear any of your nonsense, because I won't stand it. Oh dear, no." Beads of perspiration stood thickly on his patchily covered forehead. With lips stiffening and intently staring eyes, he waited for what the released prisoner would say. Hughes, whose face had blanched in the prison to a sallow, grey-white hue, and whose black eyes seemed to have sunk back into his head, slowly looked the old man up and down. At last he took his cap off, showing his cropped hair. "You got me into that, Daddy," he said, "but I don't bear your malice. Come up and have a cup of tea with us." And turning on his heel, he began to mount the stairs, followed by his wife and child. Breathing hard, the old butler mounted too. In the room on the second floor, where the baby no longer lived, a haddock on the table was endeavouring to be fresh. Round it were slices of bread on plates, a piece of butter in a pie dish, a teapot, brown sugar in a basin, and side by side a little jug of cold blue milk and a half-empty bottle of red vinegar. Close to one plate a bunch of stocks and gillyflowers reposed on the dirty tablecloth, as though dropped and forgotten by the god of love. Their faint perfume stole through the other odours. The old butler fixed his eyes on it. The poor woman bought that, he thought, hoping for it to remind him of old days. She had them flowers on her wedding day, I shouldn't wonder. This poetical conception surprising him, he turned towards the little boy and said, "This'll be a memorial for you as you get older." Without another word they all sat down. They ate in silence, and the old butler thought, "That headache ain't what it was, but a beautiful cup of tea. He don't eat nothing. He's more amenable to reason than I expected. There's no one won't be too pleased to see him now." His eyes, travelling to the spot from which the bayonet had been removed, rested on the print of the Nativity. "Suffer little children to come unto me," he thought, "and forbid them not. He'll be glad to hear there was 2 carriages followed him home." And, taking his time, he cleared his throat in preparation for speech. But before the singular muteness of this family, sounds would not come. Finishing his tea, he tremblingly rose. Things that he might have said jostled in his mind. "Very pleased to have seen you. Hope you're in good health at the present time of speaking. Don't let me intrude on you. We've all got to die sometime or other." They remained unuttered. Making a vague movement of his skinny hand, he walked feebly but quickly to the door. When he stood but halfway within the room, he made his final effort. "I'm not a-going to say nothing," he said. "That'd be superlative. I wish you a good morning." Outside he waited a second, then grasped the banister. "For all he sat so quiet, they've done him no good in that place," he thought. "Them eyes of his." And slowly he descended, full of a sort of very deep surprise. "I misjudge of him," he was thinking. "He never was nothing but an harmless human being. We all has our prejudices. I misjudge of him. They broke his heart putting him, that they have." The silence in the room continued after his departure. But when the little boy had gone to school, Hughes rose and lay down on the bed. He rested there, unmoving, with his face towards the wall, his arms clasped round his head to comfort it. The sempstress, stealing about her avocations, paused now and then to look at him. If he had raged at her, if he had raged at everything, it would not have been so terrifying as this utter silence, which passed her comprehension. This silence as of a man flung by the sea against a rock and pinned there with the life crushed out of him. All her inarticulate longing, now that her baby was gone, to be close to something in her grey life, to pass the unfranchisable barrier dividing her from the world, seemed to well up, to flow against this wall of silence, and to recoil. Twice or 3 times she addressed him timidly by name, or made some trivial remark. He did not answer, as though in very truth he had been the shadow of a man lying there. And the injustice of this silence seemed to her so terrible. Was she not his wife? Had she not borne him 5 and toiled to keep him from that girl? Was it her fault if she had made his life a hell with her jealousy, as he had cried out that morning before he went for her, and was put away? He was her man. It had been her right, nay, more, her duty. And still he lay there silent. From the narrow street, where no traffic passed, the cries of a coster and distant whistlings mounted through the unwholesome air. Some sparrows in the eave were chirruping incessantly. The little sandy house cat had stolen in, and, crouched against the doorpost, was fastening her eyes on the plate which held the remembrance of the fish. The sempstress bowed her forehead to the flowers on the table, unable any longer to bear the mystery of this silence. She wept. But the dark figure on the bed only pressed his arms closer round his head, as though there were within him a living death passing the speech of men. The little sandy cat, creeping across the floor, fixed its claws in the backbone of the fish, and drew it beneath the bed. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evans. Chapter 39. The Duel. Bianca did not see her husband after their return together from the Round Pond. She dined out that evening, and in the morning avoided any interview. When Hilary's luggage was brought down and the cab summoned, she slipped up to take shelter in her room. Presently the sound of his footsteps coming along the passage stopped outside her door. He tapped. She did not answer. Goodbye would be a mockery. Let him go with the words unsaid. And as though the thought had found its way through the closed door, she heard his footsteps recede again. She saw him presently go out to the cab with his head bent down, saw him stoop and pat Miranda. Hot tears sprang into her eyes. She heard the cab wheels roll away. The heart is like the face of an Eastern woman, warm and glowing behind swathe on swathe of fabric. At each fresh touch from the fingers of life, some new corner, some hidden curve or angle comes into view, to be seen last of all, perhaps never to be seen, by the one who owns them. When the cab had driven away, there came into Bianca's heart a sense of the irreparable, and, mysteriously entwined with that arid ache, a sort of bitter pity. What would happen to this wretched girl now that he was gone? Would she go completely to the bad, till she became one of those poor creatures like the figure in The Shadow, who stood beneath lamp-posts in the streets? Out of this speculation, which was bitter as the taste of aloes, there came to her a craving for some palliative, some sweetness, some expression of that instinct of fellow-feeling deep in each human breast, however disharmonic. But even with that craving was mingled the itch to justify herself and prove that she could rise above jealousy. She made her way to the little model's lodging. A child admitted her into the bleak passage that served for hall. A strange medley of emotions passing through Bianca's breast while she stood outside the girl's door did not show in her face, which wore its customary restrained, half-mocking look. The little model's voice faintly said, "Come in." The room was in disorder, as though soon to be deserted. A closed and corded trunk stood in the centre of the floor. The bed, stripped of clothing, lay disclosed in all the barrenness of discoloured ticking. The china utensils of the washstand were turned head downwards. Beside that washstand, the little model, with her hat on, the hat with the purplish-pink roses and the little peacock's feather, stood in the struck, shrinking attitude of one who, coming forward in the expectation of a kiss, has received a blow. "You are leaving here, then?" Bianca said quietly. "Yes," the girl murmured. "Don't you like this part? Is it too far from your work?" Again the little model whispered, "Yes." Bianca's eyes travelled slowly over the blue beflowered walls and rust-red doors. Through the dusty closeness of this dismantled room a rank scent of musk and violets rose, as though a cheap essence had been scattered as libation. A small empty scent bottle stood on the shabby-looking glass. "Have you found new lodgings?" The little model edged closer to the window. A stealthy watchfulness was creeping into her shrinking, dazed face. She shook her head. "I don't know where I'm going." Obeying a sudden impulse to see more clearly, Bianca lifted her veil. "I came to tell you," she said, "that I shall always be ready to help you." The girl did not answer, but suddenly through her black lashes she stole a look upward at her visitor. "Can you?" it seemed to say. "You help me? Oh, no, I think not." As though she had been stung by that glance, Bianca said with deadly slowness, "It is my business, of course, entirely, now that Mr. Dallison has gone abroad." The little model received this saying with a quivering jerk. It might have been an arrow transfixing her white throat. For a moment she seemed almost about to fall, but, gripping the window-sill, held herself erect. Her eyes, like an animal's in pain, darted here, there, everywhere, then rested on her visitor's breast, quite motionless. This stare, which seemed to see nothing, but to be doing, as it were, some fateful calculation, was uncanny. Colour came gradually back into her lips and eyes and cheeks. She seemed to have succeeded in her calculation, to be reviving from that stab. And
And suddenly Bianca understood. This was the meaning of the packed trunk, the dismantled room. He was going to take her, after all. In the turmoil of this discovery, 2 words alone escaped her. "I see." They were enough. The girl's face at once lost all trace of its look of desperate calculation, brightened, became guilty, and from guilty, sullen. The antagonism of all the long past months was now declared between these two. Bianca's pride could no longer conceal, the girl's submissiveness no longer obscure it. They stood like duelists, one on each side of the trunk, that common brown japanned tin trunk corded with rope. Bianca looked at it. "You," she said, "and he." Ha 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 ha. Against that cruel laughter, more poignant than 100 homilies on caste, 1,000 scornful words, the little model literally could not stand. She sat down in the low chair where she had evidently been sitting to watch the street. But as a taste of blood will infuriate a hound, so her own laughter seemed to bereave Bianca of all restraint. "What do you imagine he's taking you for, girl? Only out of pity? It's not exactly the emotion to live on in exile." "In exile? But that you do not understand." The little model staggered to her feet again. Her face had grown painfully red. "He wants me," she said. "Wants you? And he wants his dinner. And when he's eaten it, what then? No, of course he'll never abandon you. His conscience is too tender. But you'll be round his neck, like this." Bianca raised her arms, looped, and dragged them slowly down, as a mermaid's arms drag at a drowning sailor. The little model stammered, "I'll do what he tells me. I'll do what he tells me." Bianca stood silent, looking at the girl, whose heaving breast and little peacock's feather, whose small round hands twisting in front of her and sent about her clothes, all seemed an offence. "And do you suppose that he'll tell you what he wants? Do you imagine he'll have the necessary brutality to get rid of you? He'll think himself bound to keep you till you leave him, as I suppose you will some day." The girl dropped her hands. "I'll never leave him. Never!" she cried out passionately. "Then heaven help him," said Bianca. The little model's eyes seemed to lose all pupil, like 2 chicory flowers that have no dark centres. Through them, all that she was feeling struggled to find an outlet. But, too deep for words, those feelings would not pass her lips, utterly unused to express emotion. She could only stammer, I'm not, I will," and press her hands again to her breast. Bianca's lip curled. "I see. You imagine yourself capable of sacrifice. Well, you have your chance. Take it." She pointed to the corded trunk. "Now's your time. You have only to disappear." The little model shrank back against the windowsill. "He wants me," she muttered. "I know he wants me." Bianca bit her lips till the blood came. "Your idea of sacrifice," she said, "is perfect. If you went now, in a month's time, he'd never think of you again." The girl gulped. There was something so pitiful in the movements of her hands that Bianca turned away. She stood for several seconds staring at the door, then, turning round again, said, "Well?" But the girl's whole face had changed. All tear-stained indeed, she had already masked it with a sort of immovable stolidity. Bianca went swiftly up to the trunk. "You shall," she said. "Take that thing and go." The little model did not move. "So you won't?" The girl trembled violently all over. She moistened her lips, tried to speak, failed, again moistened them, and this time murmured, I'll only, if he tells me." "So you still imagine he will tell you?" The little model merely repeated, "I won't do anything without he tells me." Bianca laughed. "Why, it's like a dog," she said. But the girl had turned abruptly to the window. Her lips were parted. She was shrinking, fluttering, trembling at what she saw. She was indeed like a spaniel dog who sees her master coming.
Bianca had no need of being told that Hilary was outside. She went into the passage and opened the front door. He was coming up the steps, his face worn like that of a man in a fever, and at the sight of his wife he stood quite still, looking into her face. Without the quiver of an eyelid, without the faintest trace of emotion, or the slightest sign that she knew him to be there, Bianca passed and slowly walked away. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. Finish of the Comedy. Those who may have seen Hilary driving towards the little model's lodgings saw one who, by a fixed red spot on either cheek and the overcompression of his quivering lips, betrayed the presence of that animality which underlies even the most cultivated men. After 18 hours of the purgatory of indecision, he had not so much decided to pay that promised visit on which hung the future of 2 lives, as allow himself to be borne towards the girl. There was no one in the passage to see him after he had passed Bianca in the doorway, but it was with a face darkened by the peculiar stabbing look of wounded egoism that he entered the little model's room. The sight of it coming so closely on the struggle she had just been through was too much for the girl's self-control. Instead of going up to him, she sat down on the corded trunk and began to sob. It was the sobbing of a child whose school treat has been cancelled, of a girl whose ball dress has not come home in time. It only irritated Hilary, whose nerves had already borne all they could bear. He stood literally trembling, as though each one of these common little sobs were a blow falling on the drum-skin of his spirit, and through every fibre he took in the features of the dusty, scent-besprinkled room, the brown tin trunk, the dismantled bed, the rust-red doors. And he realized that she had burned her boats to make it impossible for a man of sensibility to disappoint her. The little model raised her face and looked at him. What she saw must have been less reassuring even than the first sight had been, for it stopped her sobbing. She rose and turned to the window, evidently trying with handkerchief and powder puff to repair the ravages caused by her tears. And when she had finished, she still stood there with her back to him. Her deep breathing made her young form quiver from her waist up to the little peacock's feather in her hat, and with each supple movement it seemed offering itself to Hilary. In the street a barrel organ had begun to play the very waltz it had played the afternoon when Mr. Stone had been so ill. Those two were neither of them conscious of that tune, too absorbed in their emotions, and yet, quietly, it was bringing something to the girl's figure, like the dowering of scent that the sun brings to a flower. It was bringing the compression back to Hilary's lips, the flush to his ears and cheeks, as a draught of wind will blow to redness a fire that has been choked. Without knowing it, without sound, inch by inch he moved nearer to her. And as though for all there was no sign of his advance, she knew of it. She stayed utterly unmoved, except for the deep breathing that so stirred the warm youth in her. In that stealthy progress was the history of life and the mystery of sex. Inch by inch he neared her, and she swayed, mesmerizing his arms to fold round her, thus poised, as if she must fall backward, mesmerizing him to forget that there was anything there, anything in all the world, but just her young form waiting for him. Nothing but that. The barrel organ stopped. The spell had broken. She turned round to him. As a wind obscures with grey wrinkles the still green waters of enchantment into which some mortal had been gazing, so Hilary's reason suddenly swept across the situation and showed it once more as it was. Quick to mark every shade that passed across his face, the girl made as though she would again burst into tears. Then, since tears had been so useless, she pressed her hand over her eyes. Hilary looked at that round, not too cleanly hand. He could see her watching him between her fingers. It was uncanny, almost horrible, like the sight of a cat watching a bird. And he stood, appalled at the terrible reality of his position, at the sight of his own future with this girl, with her traditions, customs, life, the 1,001 things that he did not know about her, that he would have to live with if he once took her. A minute passed, which seemed eternity, for into it was condensed every force of her long pursuit, her instinctive clutching at something that she felt to be security, her reaching upwards, her twining round him. Conscious of all this, held back by that vision of his future, yet whipped towards her by his senses, Hilary swayed like a drunken man. And suddenly she sprang at him, wreathed her arms round his neck, and fastened her mouth to his. The touch of her lips was moist and hot. The scent of stale violet powder came from her, warmed by her humanity. It penetrated to Hilary's heart. He started back in sheer physical revolt. Thus repulsed, the girl stood rigid, her breast heaving, her eyes unnaturally dilated, her mouth still loosened by the kiss. Snatching from his pocket a roll of notes, Hilary flung them on the bed. "I can't take you," he almost groaned. It's madness. It's impossible." And he went out into the passage. He ran down the steps and got into his cab. An immense time seemed to pass before it began to move. It started at last, and Hilary sat back in it, his hands clenched, still as a dead man. His mortified face was recognised by the landlady, returning from her morning's visit to the shops. The gentleman looked, she thought, as if he had received bad news. She not unnaturally connected his appearance with her lodger. Tapping on the girl's door and receiving no answer, she went in. The little model was lying on the dismantled bed, pressing her face into the blue and white ticking of the bolster. Her shoulders shook, and a sound of smothered sobbing came from her. The landlady stood staring silently. Coming of Cornish chapel-going stock, she had never liked this girl, her instinct telling her that she was one for whom life had already been too much. Those for whom life had so early been too much, she knew, were always ones for pleasure. Her experience of village life had enabled her to construct the little model's story, that very simple, very frequent little story. Sometimes, indeed, trouble of that sort was soon over and forgotten. But sometimes, if the young man didn't do the right thing by her, and the girl's folk took it hardly, well then. So had run the reasoning of this good woman. Being of the same class, she had looked at her lodger from the first, without obliquity of vision. But, seeing her now apparently so overwhelmed, and having something soft and warm down beneath her granitic face and hungry eyes, she touched her on the back. "Come now," she said, "you mustn't take on. What is it?" The little model shook off the hand as a passionate child shakes itself free of consolation. "Let me alone," she muttered. The landlady drew back. "Has anyone done you wrong?" she said. The little model shook her head. Baffled by this dumb grief, the landlady was silent. Then, with the stolidity of those whose lives are one long wrestling with fortune, she muttered, "I don't like to see anyone cry like that." Finding that the girl remained obstinately withdrawn from sight or sympathy, she moved towards the door. "Well," she said, with ironical compassion, "if you want me, I'll be in the kitchen." The little model remained lying on her bed. Every now and then she gulped, like a child flung down on the grass apart from its comrades, trying to swallow down its rage, trying to bury in the earth its little black moment of despair. Slowly those gulps grew fewer, feebler, and at last died away. She sat up, sweeping Hilary's bundle of notes, on which she had been lying, to the floor. At sight of that bundle she broke out afresh, flinging herself down sideways with her cheek on the wet bolster, and for some time after her sobs had ceased again, still lay there. At last she rose and dragged herself over to the looking-glass, scrutinizing her streaked, discoloured face, the stains in her cheeks, the swollen eyelids, the marks beneath her eyes. Listlessly she tidied herself. Then, sitting down on the brown tin trunk, she picked the bundle of notes off the floor. They gave forth a dry, peculiar crackle. 15 £10 notes, all Hilary's travelling money. Her eyes opened wider and wider as she counted, and tears, quite suddenly, rolled down onto those thin slips of paper. Then slowly she undid her dress and forced them down till they rested with nothing but her vest between them and the quivering warm flesh which hid her heart. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Fraternity by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. The House of Harmony. At 10:30 that evening, Stephen walked up the stone-flagged pathway of his brother's house. "Can I see Mrs. Hilary?" "Mr. Hilary went abroad this morning, sir. Mrs. Hilary has not yet come in." "Will you give her this letter?" "No, I'll wait. I suppose I can wait for her in the garden." "Oh, yes, sit." "Very well. I'll leave the door open, sir, in case you want to come in." Stephen walked across to the rustic bench and sat down. He stared gloomily through the dusk at his patent leather boots, and every now and then he flicked his evening trousers with the letter. Across the dark garden, where the boughs hung soft, unmoved by wind, the light from Mr. Stone's open window flowed out in a pale river. Moths, born of the sudden heat, were fluttering up this river to its source. Stephen looked irritably at the figure of Mr. Stone, which could be seen, bowed and utterly still, beside his desk. So by lifting the spy-hole thatch one may see a convict in his cell stand gazing at his work, without movement, numb with solitude. "He's getting awfully broken up," thought Stephen. "Poor old chap. His ideas are killing him. They're not human nature, never will be." Again he flicked his trousers with the letter, as though that document emphasized the fact. "I can't help being sorry for the sublime old idiot." He rose, the better to see his father-in-law's unconscious figure. It looked as lifeless and as cold as though Mr. Stone had followed some thought below the ground, and left his body standing there to await his return. Its appearance oppressed Stephen. He might set the house on fire, he thought. He'd never notice. Mr. Stone's figure moved. The sound of a long sigh came out to Stephen in the windless garden. He turned his eyes away with the sudden feeling that it was not the thing to watch the old chap like this. Then, getting up, he went indoors. In his brother's study he stood turning over the knick-knacks on the writing-table. "I warned Hilary that he was burning his fingers," he thought. At the sound of the latchkey he went back to the hall. However much he had secretly disapproved of her from the beginning, because she had always seemed to him such an uncomfortable and tantalizing person, Stephen was impressed that night by the haunting unhappiness of Bianca's face, as if it had been suddenly disclosed to him that she could not help herself. This was disconcerting, being in a sense a disorderly way of seeing things. "You look tired, Bea," he said. "I'm sorry, but I thought it better to bring this round tonight." Bianca glanced at the letter. "It is to you," she said. "I don't wish to read it, thank you." Stephen compressed his lips. "But I wish you to hear it, please," he said. "I'll read it out, if you'll allow me. Charing Cross Station. Dear Stevie, I told you yesterday morning that I was going abroad alone. Afterwards I changed my mind. I meant to take her. I went to her lodgings for the purpose. I've lived too long amongst sentiments for such a piece of reality as that. Class has saved me. It has triumphed over my most primitive instincts. I'm going alone, back to my sentiments. No slight has been placed on Bianca, but my married life having become a mockery, I shall not return to it. The following address will find me, and I shall ask you presently to send on my household gods. Please let Bianca know the substance of this letter. Ever your affectionate brother, Hilary Dallison." With a frown, Stephen folded up the letter and restored it to his breast pocket. "It's more better than I thought," he reflected, "and yet he's done the only possible thing." Bianca was leaning her elbow on the mantelpiece with her face turned to the wall.
Her silence irritated Stephen, whose loyalty to his brother longed to find a vent. "I'm very much relieved, of course," he said at last. "It would have been fatal." She did not move, and Stephen became increasingly aware that this was a most awkward matter to touch on. "Of course," he began again, "but I do think I mean—" And again he stopped before her utter silence, her utter immobility. Then, unable to go away without having in some sort expressed his loyalty to Hilary, he tried once more. "Hilary is the kindest man I know. It's not his fault if he's out of touch with life, if he's not fit to deal with things. He's negative." And having thus, in a single word, somewhat to his own astonishment, described his brother, he held out his hand. The hand which Bianca placed in it was feverishly hot. Stephen felt suddenly compunctious. I'm awfully sorry," he stammered, "about the whole thing. I'm awfully sorry for you." Bianca drew back her hand. With a little shrug, Stephen turned away. What are you to do with women like that? Was his thought. And saying dryly, "Good night, Bee," he went. For some time Bianca sat in Hilary's chair. Then, by the faint glimmer coming through the half-open door, she began to wander round the room, touching the walls, the books, the prints, all the familiar things amongst which she had lived so many years. In that dim, continual journey, she was like a disharmonic spirit, traversing the air above where its body lies. The door creaked behind her. A voice said sharply, "What are you doing in this house?" Mr. Stone was standing beside the bust of Socrates. Bianca went up to him. "Father!" Mr. Stone stared. "It is you! I thought it was a thief. Where's Hilary?" "Gone away." "Alone?" Bianca bowed her head. "It's very late, Dad," she whispered. Mr. Stone's hand moved as though he would have stroked her. "The human heart," he murmured, "is the tomb of many feelings." Bianca put her arm round him. "You must go to bed, Dad," she said, trying to get him to the door, for in her heart something seemed giving way. Mr. Stone stumbled. The door swung to. The room was plunged in darkness. A hand, cold as ice, brushed her cheek. With all her force she stifled a scream. "I am here," Mr. Stone said. His hand, wandering downwards, touched her shoulder, and she seized it with her own burning hand. Thus linked, they groped their way out into the passage towards his room. "Good night, dear," Bianca murmured. By the light of his now open door, Mr. Stone seemed to try and see her face, but she would not show it to him. Closing the door gently, she stole upstairs. Sitting down in her bedroom by the open window, it seemed to her that the room was full of people. Her nerves were so unstrung. It was as if walls had not the power this night to exclude human presences. Moving or motionless, now distinct, then covered suddenly by the thick veil of some material object, they circled round her quiet figure, lying back in the chair with shut eyes. These disharmonic shadows, flitting in the room, made a stir like the rubbing of dry straw or the hum of bees among clover stalks. When she sat up, they vanished, and the sounds became the distant din of homing traffic. But the moment she closed her eyes, her visitors again began to steal round her with that dry, mysterious hum. She fell asleep presently, and woke with a start. There, in a glimmer of pale light, stood the little model, as in the fatal picture Bianca had painted of her. Her face was powder white, with shadows beneath the eyes. Breath seemed coming through her parted lips, just touched with colour. In her hat lay the tiny peacock's feather beside the two purplish-pink roses. A scent came from her too, but faint as ever was the scent of chicory flower. How long had she been standing there? Bianca started to her feet, and as she rose, the vision vanished. She went towards the spot. There was nothing in that corner but moonlight. The scent she had perceived was merely that of the trees drifting in. But so vivid had that vision been that she stood at the window, panting for air, passing her hand again and again across her eyes. Outside, Over the dark gardens the moon hung full and almost golden. Its honey-pale light filtered down on every shape of tree and leaf and sleeping flower. That soft, vibrating radiance seemed to have woven all into one mysterious whole, stilling disharmony, so that each little separate shape had no meaning to itself. Bianca looked long at the rain of moonlight falling on the earth's carpet like a covering shower of blossom which bees have sucked and spilled. Then, below her, out through candescent space, she saw a shadow dart forth along the grass, and to her fright a voice rose, tremulous and clear, seeming to seek enfranchisement beyond the barrier of the dark trees. "My brain is clouded. Great universe, I cannot write. I can no longer discover to my brothers that they are one. I am not worthy to stay here. Let me pass into you and die." Bianca saw her father's fragile arm stretch out into the night through the sleeves of his white garment, as though expecting to be received at once into the universal brotherhood of the thin air. There ensued a moment when, by magic, every little dissonance in all the town seemed blended into a harmony of silence, as it might be the very death of self upon the earth. Then, breaking that trance, Mr. Stone's voice rose again, trembling out into the night, as though blown through a reed. "Brothers," he said. Behind the screen of lilac bushes at the gate, Bianca saw the dark helmet of a policeman. He stood there staring readily in the direction of that voice. Raising his lantern, he flashed it into every corner of the garden, searching for those who had been addressed. Satisfied, apparently, that no one was there, he moved it to right and left, lowered it to the level of his breast, and walked slowly on. End of chapter 41. End of Fraternity by John Galsworthy.